Have you ever stood at the edge of a hollow where the birds don't sing, even in the middle of summer, even with the creek running low and sweet just 20 feet away? Have you ever walked a fence line built of fieldstone stacked so tight, so patient, that you knew before anyone told you that whoever built it had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be? Have you ever looked at a barn from the road, just an old gray barn, leaning east the way old barns do, and felt something in your chest tell you, plainly, without drama, that you did not want to know what happened inside it? There is a hollow like that in Stone County, Missouri, 6 miles off the old Cassie Mills Road, where the ridge folds in on itself twice before it lets you down into a bowl of land the sun only touches for about 4 hours a day. Locals who still remember the stories, and there are fewer of them every year, call it Calloway Hollow, though it does not appear under that name on any state map printed after 1940. On the older survey plats, the ones kept in the basement annex of the Stone County Recorder's Office, it is simply Parcel 11, Township 24 North, Range 17 West. 240 acres. Purchased in 1881 by a woman named Delphine Calloway for the sum of $610, paid in full, in cash, by a woman who, according to the same records, had never before held a bank account in her own name. By 1896, 44 men who had passed through that hollow were gone. Not dead, as far as anyone could prove, not buried, as far as anyone could find. Simply gone, the way a name goes out of a ledger when someone draws a single black line through it and writes nothing else. This is that story. I am going to tell it to you slowly, and I am going to tell it to you straight, the way it was told to me, with the names left as they were left in the county record, and the details left as specific as I could get them, because I have found in 11 years of doing this that softening a story like this one, rounding off its edges to make it easier to hear, is the surest way to lose the thing that makes it true. Get comfortable. This one runs long, and it should. Some stories don't fit in 20 minutes. This is one of them. Before I go any further, I want to tell you about something I've been building for the past year, alongside these single-case documentaries. It's called The Ozark Ledger, a 10-part collection, just over 9 hours total, going county by county through the disappearances the state of Missouri has on paper but never solved, never closed, and mostly never talks about. The Calloway case you're about to hear is the 6th entry in that collection, and if this is the kind of case that keeps you up thinking, not scared exactly, just turning it over, that collection is where the rest of them live. But before I go on with tonight's case, tell me where you're watching this from. Put it in the comments, right now if you can, before you forget. I like to see, by the time this hits its second hour, how far out a single case like this one traveled in one night. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it's the only way the next one finds you when it's ready. Now then, back to Stone County, and to a hollow that, as far as the county is concerned, has been quiet since 1896 and never once explained. His name, in this telling, was Everett Pruitt Coldwell, and in the spring of 1896 he was 31 years old, a land surveyor and sometime deputized process server working out of Springfield, Missouri, for the firm of Danvers and Holt. Everett was not from the Ozarks originally. He had come down from Sedalia 9 years earlier, following a surveying contract for the railroad that never quite panned out the way the railroad promised, and he had stayed because, as he wrote in a letter to his sister that spring, a letter that survives, folded into eighths. In a box at the State Historical Society of Missouri in Columbia, there is more honest work in these hills than a man could do in 3 lifetimes, and I intend to try. Everett was not married in 1896, but he had been, for 4 years, to a woman named Josephine Ann Coldwell, née Voss, who had died in the winter of 1893 of what the Springfield doctor's ledger recorded only as a wasting fever of the chest, almost certainly. By what we understand today, a tubercular pneumonia that took her over 11 weeks, from the first dry cough in October to the last week of December, when Everett wrote in his own hand, in a small ledger book he kept for such things, that Josephine had died at 9 minutes past 4 in the morning, and that the house had been so quiet afterward that he had gone outside in his shirt sleeves in the cold just to hear something, anything that wasn't the silence of the room behind him. Josephine had a habit Everett mentioned more than once in his surviving letters. She counted stitches out loud when she sewed, not because she needed to. She was a fine seamstress and had been since she was a girl, but because she told him once, and he wrote it down word for word because he liked the way she said it. A thing done in silence doesn't feel finished to me, Ev. I like to hear myself get somewhere. She hated buttermilk, would not touch it, and she had a scar on her left forearm from a childhood burn that she was oddly proud of and would show to children who asked, telling them a wildly exaggerated story about a bear that had nothing to do with how she actually got it, which was a kitchen stove. These are small things. I am telling them to you because they matter later, in a way that I think you will find, by the end of tonight, harder to shake than anything else in this story. By the spring of 1896, Everett had been a widower for a little over 2 years, and he had thrown himself into his surveying work with what his employer, a man named Holt, later described in a deposition as an intensity that bordered, at times, on the reckless. Everett took contracts other men in the firm declined, contested boundary lines deep in hollows where the roads gave out, disputed timber claims on land nobody had walked in a generation, and, that April, a very particular contract. The settlement of a boundary dispute between a landowner named Delphine Calloway and her nearest neighbor to the east, a hog farmer named Thaddeus Purnell, over 11 acres of bottomland along a nameless creek that fed, eventually, into Beaver Creek and from there into the White River. It was, on paper, an unremarkable job. Everett had done a dozen like it. He was expected to be gone 8 days, 10 at the outside, and he told his landlady in Springfield, a Mrs. Agatha Renner, that he would be back by the 22nd of April at the latest, in time for a supper she had promised him, fried chicken, because it was his birthday. He never came back for the chicken. What we know of what happened to Everett Coldwell after he rode south out of Springfield on the 11th of April, 1896, comes from 3 sources, and I want to be honest with you about all 3. Before I go further, because I think you deserve to weigh this evidence the way I had to weigh it. The first source is Everett's own survey notebook, recovered, and I will get to how, later, which contains dated entries up through the 16th of April, and then, after a gap of 4 days, a final entry, undated, written in a hand his employer swore under oath was Everett's own, though shakier than anything else in the book. The second source is the sworn testimony of Thaddeus Purnell, the neighbor, given to the Stone County Sheriff on the 29th of April when Everett failed to file the completed survey and Purnell rode into town to ask where his boundary line had gotten to. And the third source, the one that takes the longest to earn, and the one I am going to save until we've walked the rest of this properly, is a journal that was not found until 1898, 2 years after Everett Coldwell disappeared, tucked inside the false bottom of a cedar trunk in a house 6 miles from where he was last seen alive. I'll tell you now, that journal did not belong to Everett Coldwell. It belonged to somebody else, somebody who went into Calloway Hollow 4 years before he did, and never came out either. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the road. Everett rode south out of Springfield on a gray horse named Duchess, following the old wagon road down through Ozark and Ponce de Leon and Chadwick, a 2-day ride at a comfortable pace, and by the account he later gave to an innkeeper in Chadwick, a woman named Ruth Beckwith, who remembered him clearly enough, 3 years on, to describe the exact color of his coat to a newspaperman. He was in good spirits, joking about the fried chicken waiting for him, showing no sign of a man riding toward anything but ordinary work. It was in Chadwick, on the evening of the 12th of April, that Everett first heard the name Calloway, spoken in a tone he would later describe in his own notebook as peculiar. He had mentioned, over supper at the Beckwith house, that he was riding on to survey a boundary for a Miss Delphine Calloway, out past Kissee Mills, and the room by Ruth Beckwith's account, given to that same newspaperman in 1899, went quiet in a way that made her own husband set down his fork. "You mean the Calloway place?" her husband, a man named Otis Beckwith, said. Not a question, a confirmation, the way a man says a thing he'd rather not have to say twice. "I do," Everett answered, by his own account. "Do you know it?" And Otis Beckwith gave him 3 pieces of advice that night. Over a supper table, with his wife sitting silent beside him, 3 pieces of advice that Everett wrote down almost verbatim in his notebook that same evening, because, he noted, Beckwith delivered them like a man reciting a catechism he had said too many times to enjoy saying again. The first: do your work in daylight, start to finish, and be off the property by the time the sun touches the ridge on the west side of the hollow, because the light goes strange there before it goes dark, and you want to be gone before it does. The second: if either of the Calloway sisters offers you supper, or a bed, or water from their well, decline it as many times as it takes for them to stop asking, and do not let politeness get the better of you, because Otis Beckwith had known one man who accepted a drummer selling sewing notions some 11 years back, and that man's horse had come back to the main road alone 3 days later, saddle still cinched, saddlebags still packed, and the man himself was never seen in that county again. And the third, and Beckwith made Everett repeat this one back to him before he'd let the subject drop, count the men. If you see other men working that land, tally them in your head, keep the number fixed, and if that number changes without you seeing a soul come or go, leave. Don't ask why. Don't go looking for the one that's missing. Just leave. And then, Everett wrote, he told me he would not speak of it again, and true to his word, when I tried to press him on it after his wife had gone to bed, he only shook his head and said, "A man who talks too much about that hollow tends to find himself thinking about it at night," and he had daughters of his own to raise, and didn't care for the thinking. Everett, by his notebook's own account, found this all rather colorful, the kind of story a man tells a stranger passing through to make his own hollow seem more interesting than it is. And he wrote on the next morning, without much more thought given to it, other than to write, half joking, "Will endeavor not to drink Miss Calloway's well water on the off chance Mr. Beckwith is a prophet." He arrived at the edge of the Calloway property on the afternoon of the 14th of April, 1896. And this right here at the fence line, with the sun still high and the birds, he noted, unusually absent, is where his notebook entries begin to change in a way that is very easy to miss on a first read and very hard to unsee on a second. Let me show you what I mean, because this is where the story really starts, and I don't want to rush it. The Calloway property was bordered on its east side, where Everett's survey work began, by a fieldstone wall that ran for nearly half a mile without a single gap, without a single stone out of place, built to a height of just over 4 feet the entire way. Everett, a surveyor by trade and a careful observer of built things, noted in his book that a wall like that represented by his estimate not less than 1,100 man-hours of labor, and possibly a great deal more, for a wall serving no evident agricultural purpose, as the land on either side is unfit for grazing and the wall follows no natural grade. He noted, too, that the stones were dry stacked without mortar, in a technique he recognized from his time near the railroad as distinctly Old World, more common to the stone walls of New England or the British Isles than anything he had seen built locally, and that the wall showed no sign of frost, heave, or settling, as though it had either been built with unusual skill or built far more recently than its weathered appearance would suggest. This was the first small wrongness. It would not be the last, and I want you to hold on to it, because by the end of the night we're about to walk through together, you'll understand why the wall mattered more than Everett could have known when he wrote that entry. He found the gate a simple wooden gate hung on iron hinges, no lock, a little past 2 in the afternoon, and it was there that he met Delphine Calloway for the first time. Delphine, by Everett's description, was a woman of perhaps 45 years, though he noted that her age was hard to place, Her hands are a young woman's hands, unmarked by field work despite what must be considerable labor kept up on this land, while her eyes carry an age I would put closer to 70. She wore, he wrote, a plain gray dress of good cloth, better cloth than a farm woman of that country would ordinarily own, and she greeted him at the gate as though she had been expecting him at that exact hour, though he had sent no word ahead of his arrival time. "You'll be the surveyor?" she said. "Not a question." "I am, ma'am. Everett Coldwell, out of Springfield, for the Purnell boundary." "I know what you're here for," Delphine said, and Everett wrote that she smiled when she said it. A pleasant smile, and yet I found myself, without any clear reason I could name, wishing she had not smiled at all. She introduced her sister, Cassandra Calloway, younger by what Everett guessed to be 10 years, though again he noted the same strange difficulty placing her age precisely, a woman handsome in a way that seemed almost deliberately understated, as though she had decided long ago that handsomeness was a tool best kept sheathed. And the two sisters walked him along the disputed boundary that afternoon with what Everett described as remarkable, almost suspicious familiarity with every rock, every bent tree, every old fence post on land that, by the county deed, had only been theirs for 15 years. It was on that first walk that Everett performed the third piece of Otis Beckwith's advice without quite meaning to. He counted the men. There were, by his tally that first afternoon, 4 hired men working the Calloway land, 2 clearing brush along the disputed creek bottom, 1 repairing a section of the same field stone wall near the barn, and 1 an older man, gray-bearded, who did not look up from his work the entire time. Everett was in sight of him mending a horse harness on the porch of a low outbuilding near what Everett's notes call the second barn. 4 men. Everett wrote the number down. 4. He would write that number again, twice more, over the following 2 days, and each time it would still read 4. And each time he noted with a kind of forced casualness that reads, on the page, like a man trying to convince himself, the same 4 men, I believe, though I confess I could not tell you with certainty that the man mending harness on the second day was the same man mending harness on the first, as I did not see his face either time. That first evening, Delphine offered him supper. He declined, remembering Beckwith's second warning, and told her he had provisions of his own and would prefer to make his camp along the creek, out past the fence line, where his gear was already staked. Delphine did not press him. She accepted my refusal with a graciousness that somehow unsettled me more than insistence would have. He wrote, but Cassandra, the younger sister, laughed softly at something as he turned to go, a laugh Everett could not place any humor behind, and said, just loud enough for him to hear, "He'll come round to supper eventually. They always do, once the nights get long enough." Everett wrote that he told himself this was simply a country woman's strange idea of a joke, and that he did not sleep well that first night regardless, though he could not, at the time, say precisely why. He described the sounds. There is a passage in his notebook, dated the 15th of April, that I want to read to you close to word for word, because paraphrasing it loses something in the specificity. And specificity, as I told you, is the thing that makes a story like this hard to shake. He wrote that somewhere after midnight he woke to the sound of what he first took to be cattle lowing, far off on the Calloway side of the creek, except that he had seen no cattle on the property that day, only the 4 hired men and a modest kitchen garden, and the sound, the longer he lay awake listening to it, did not resolve into cattle at all, but into something closer to a woman's voice, pitched low, counting he was almost certain it was counting, though he could never afterward say what number it reached before it stopped and that the sound had come, as best he could judge, lying flat in his bedroll with the creek noise all around him. From the direction of the second barn, the low outbuilding where the gray-bearded man had been mending harness that afternoon. He got up. He walked, by his own account, some 60 yards toward the fence line before the sound stopped entirely all at once. The way a held breath stops, rather than the way a voice trails off, and he stood at the fence in the dark for what he judged to be 10 minutes more, hearing nothing but the creak, before he returned to his bedroll and did not sleep again that night. In the morning, he counted the men again. 4. He finished the eastern boundary line on the 16th of April, and it was that evening, packing his instruments by the last of the daylight, that he made the notebook entry that I think marks the real turn in this story, the moment where a careful, professional man's account stops sounding like a man doing his job and starts sounding like a man trying very hard not to sound afraid. The barn, he wrote, the second one, the low one near the western tree line. I paced it off today without quite meaning to, out of habit more than suspicion, while waiting on Miss Cassandra to bring me a corrected plat reference. 61 feet by 34 feet on the outside, by my own tape. I went inside briefly, at Miss Delphine's invitation, to look at a stack of fence posts she wished surveyed as part of the disputed acreage. The inside measures, by my eye and a rough interior pace, no more than 52 feet by 26. I do not know what to make of this and have resolved to remeasure tomorrow before I say anything to either sister, in case I have simply erred, as any man might after a long day's work. But I confess, the discrepancy has put me in an unsettled frame of mind, and I find myself writing this by lamplight at my camp, glancing rather more often than usual toward the tree line. That is where the notebook's dated entries end. The 16th of April, 1896. There is a gap of 4 days. And then, in a hand his own employer would later swear to under oath as unmistakably Everett Coldwell's, though shaken, cramped, and written, based on the smearing of the ink, in what appears to have been very poor light or very unsteady hands, there is one final entry, undated, that I am going to read to you in full, because I think, after everything you've just heard, you've earned the right to hear it exactly as he wrote it, and not a version smoothed out for easier listening. I do not know what day this is. I believe it has been 3 nights, perhaps 4, since I last wrote, though I cannot account for all of them, and that itself frightens me more than anything I am about to set down. I stayed to supper. I want that written plainly, because I think, if anyone reads this after me, they should know it was my own choice, and not some trickery that took the choice from me. Miss Delphine asked a 4th time on the evening of the 17th, and I was cold and tired of my own cooking, and I told myself Beckwith was an old man given to old stories, and I went in. The supper was ordinary, good even. Cassandra played a hymn on a small parlor organ afterward, and I thought, God forgive me, that I had spent 3 nights afraid of nothing at all. I do not remember agreeing to stay the night. I remember the organ. I remember Delphine's hand on my sleeve, guiding me, she said, to a spare room at the top of the stairs, because the hour had gotten away from us, and it was no trouble at all, and my horse was already stabled and would keep till morning. I remember the room had no mirror in it, and I remember thinking that was odd, and then not thinking of it again. I woke I do not know how much later to the counting. Close this time, not across the creek. Below me, I believe, or beside me, a voice pitched low, and even a woman's voice, going 1, 2, 3, in a rhythm like a person taking a slow and careful inventory of something in the dark, and under it, fainter, another voice, and under that, another, until I understood, lying still, with my heart going in my chest like a hammer, that I was hearing more than one voice counting, layered atop each other, none of them quite in time with the others. I got up. I do not remember deciding to get up, only that I was at the window, and the moon was up, and I could see, from that window, the second barn, the low one, the one that measures wrong on the inside, and there was a light in it, not lamplight, a pale light, low to the ground, the kind of light I have only ever seen once before in my life, on a marsh at night, the kind old men call foxfire, and blame on rotting wood, except that light does not move on its own, and this light was moving slow, back and forth, along what I judged to be the interior wall of that barn. I counted the men the next morning as I always have. I counted 5. There have only ever been 4. I have counted them a dozen times over 4 days, and it has always been 4. And this morning, with my hands shaking so badly I nearly could not hold my own pencil to write this, I counted 5, and the 5th man, the new one, standing near the fence with his back to me, was wearing a gray coat very much like my own, and when he turned his head, just slightly, just enough for me to see the line of his jaw against the morning light. I am going to go and look at the barn again before I leave this place. I know what Beckwith told me. I know I should simply ride for the county road and not look back. But there is a man out there wearing my coat, and I need to know, before God, whether that man has my face as well, because if he does, I do not think I want to know what that means for the man standing here writing this, and I think the entry ends there. Mid-sentence, Everett Coldwell's notebook was found 9 days later, on the 29th of April, 1896, in a saddlebag on his horse, Duchess, who was discovered grazing loose along the county road nearly 4 miles from the Calloway property, saddle still cinched, saddlebag still packed with his surveying instruments and his personal effects. Exactly, and I want you to sit with this detail exactly the way Otis Beckwith had described another man's horse coming back, 11 years before Everett Coldwell ever rode down that same road. Everett Coldwell was never seen again. I want to slow down here and stay with those first 2 days at the Calloway place a while longer, because I've learned that the temptation in a story like this one is always to rush toward the frightening part, and rushing is exactly the wrong instinct. The frightening part only lands the way it's meant to if you've first sat in the ordinary part long enough to feel how ordinary it truly was, how a careful, sensible, unhaunted man could walk into that hollow, spend 2 full days measuring fence lines and eating his own cold provisions by a creek, and feel nothing at all except a vague, dismissible unease he had every reason in the world to explain away. Everett Coldwell was, by every account that survives of him, precisely the sort of man least likely to be taken in by a ghost story. His employer Holt described him in deposition as the most literal-minded surveyor I ever employed, a man who trusted his tape measure and his compass and very little else, and who once spent an entire afternoon disproving a client's claim of a haunted well by measuring the exact acoustics of the well shaft and demonstrating that the moaning the family had heard for 2 years was nothing more than wind crossing the mouth of the shaft at a particular angle in the pond, autumn months. This was not a credulous man. This was not a man primed to see the supernatural in a badly built barn, and that, I think, is exactly why his notebook matters the way it does, because you can watch, entry by entry, a determined skeptic's certainty erode not through fear, but through the slow accumulation of small measured facts that refuse to add up the way measured facts are supposed to. Consider the tree line. Everett mentioned it 3 separate times in his first 2 days, each time in the flat, professional register of a man noting an oddity for later investigation rather than a man frightened by it. The western tree line of the Calloway property, where the second barn stood, was by his description unnaturally even, as though every tree along its edge had been topped and trimmed to a uniform height by a hand that cared a great deal about the line it presented to the hollow, though I can see no agricultural or practical purpose such trimming would serve, and no evidence of the cut branches anywhere on the ground below, which one would expect to find in abundance if the trimming were recent. A tree line trimmed dead level, with no sign of who trimmed it or where the cuttings went. He filed it under curiosities. He would not have the chance to file it under anything else. Consider the cold. Everett noted, on his second morning, that his camp by the creek, a good 150 yards from the fence line, on open ground with no unusual shade, had been, at dawn, markedly colder than the surrounding air, cold enough that I woke with frost on the outside of my bedroll, despite a night that was, by my thermometer, which I carry for reasons of my trade, some 8 degrees above freezing at its lowest. I can offer no explanation for localized frost forming on my person and my gear, while the grass, not 10 feet distant, showed none. I have resolved to move my camp further from the fence line tonight, though I confess I feel foolish setting it down as a reason. He moved his camp. He does not record whether the second morning was warmer, which suggests, reading between the lines, the way you learn to read a careful man's silences, that it was not. And consider, above all, the sound of the place which Everett kept circling back to the way a tongue keeps finding a sore tooth. It was not that the hollow was loud, it was that it was wrong, quiet. Quiet in a way that a man who has spent 9 years surveying in deep country knows is not natural, because deep country is never truly silent. There is always the layered undersound of insects and birds and small moving things, a sound so constant that you stop hearing it consciously and only notice its absence. Everett noticed its absence. "The hollow holds a silence," he wrote, "that I can only compare to the silence of a room in which someone has very recently stopped speaking, and in which everyone present is waiting, without acknowledging that they are waiting, to see whether the speaker will begin again." That is a remarkable sentence for a literal-minded surveyor to have written about a patch of Missouri woods, and I think he knew it was remarkable because he underlined it, the only underlined sentence in the entire notebook, as though even he could not quite believe he had committed such a thing to the page. These are the details that were accumulating in the days before Everett Coldwell ever heard a voice, ever saw a light in the barn, ever counted a fifth man where there had only been 4. This is the ground the horror grew from, and it grew slowly, and it grew out of exactly the kind of small measured wrongness that a sensible man tells himself over and over adds up to nothing at all, right up until the night it adds up to everything. I dwell on this because I want you to understand something about how that hollow worked, something that becomes clearer the more of these accounts you lay side by side. It did not announce itself. It did not need to. It simply waited, in its wrong quiet, its level tree line, its localized frost, its barn that measured smaller inside than out, and it let each man's own good sense do the work of keeping him there, because a man who flees at the first oddity keeps his life. But a man who stays to rationally investigate each oddity in turn, to disprove it, to measure it and file it away, that man has already, without knowing it, agreed to stay one more night. And one more night, in that hollow, was always the price. There is a further stretch of Everett Coldwell's second and third days at the hollow that I passed over quickly the first time through, and I want to return to it now, because it contains the single strangest of his early observations, and one that has never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who has studied this case. On the afternoon of the 15th of April, while running his boundary line along the disputed creek bottom, Everett came upon a set of footprints in the soft mud of the bank, and being a man of methodical habits, he stopped to examine them, initially for no better reason than that they crossed his survey line, and he wanted to note whether they belonged to one of the Calloway hands or to some trespasser he ought to mention to Miss Delphine. The prints, he wrote, were a man's boot prints, a large man, and they came down the bank from the direction of the second barn, walked some 40 feet along the creek, and then stopped at the water's edge, as though the man had knelt to drink or to wash. That was ordinary enough. What was not ordinary was what Everett noticed when he followed the prints back the other way, toward the barn. The returning tracks, he wrote, made by the same boots, the same distinctive worn heel on the left foot, do not match the outgoing tracks in one particular that I have measured 3 times now to be certain of it. The stride of the returning tracks is longer than the stride of the outgoing tracks by very nearly 4 inches, consistently, print after print, the whole distance back to where the trail becomes too hard-packed to read. A man's stride does not lengthen by 4 inches between walking down to a creek and walking back from it. A man's stride lengthens like that only if he has grown taller, or if the man who walked back is not, in some particular I cannot bring myself to specify, quite the same man who walked down. He measured it 3 times. That is the detail that stays with me. A frightened man measures once and flees. Everett Coldwell knelt in the creek mud and measured a dead man's stride 3 times because the arithmetic would not resolve, and he could not walk away from arithmetic that would not resolve. It was, I think, the central flaw and the central dignity of the man, and the hollow used it against him with a patience that is almost obscene to contemplate. He noted, too, that the boot prints did not belong to any of the 4 hired men he had by then observed closely, none of whom wears a boot of that size, and none of whom, to my knowledge, has had cause to walk that particular stretch of the creek bottom in the days I have been here. He resolved to ask Miss Delphine whose prints they were. There is no record that he ever did, or that if he did, he received any answer worth writing down. The prints simply enter his notebook, are measured 3 times, and are never mentioned again, one more piece of unresolved arithmetic in a place that seemed to generate nothing else. I have thought a great deal about those footprints, about a man walking down to a creek to drink, ordinary as anything, and a man walking back who is 4 inches longer in the stride, print after print, the whole way. About which of those 2 men, if either, was the one who had come to that hollow with a name and a history and people waiting on him somewhere, and about what it would mean, what it would actually, concretely mean, for the second set of prints to be the true record of what walked back up that bank toward the barn, wearing the first man's boots, having drunk from the first man's creek, on its way to take the first man's place at the fence line where, some morning soon, a surveyor would count it and arrive, with a lurch of his careful heart, at a number 1 higher than it had any right to be. Before I move on to the sheriff's investigation, I want to give you something I think deepens Everett Coldwell's account rather than repeats it, because Everett was not, it turns out, the only outside visitor to leave a written impression of those first few days at the Calloway place before things went fully wrong for him. There is a second source, thinner than his notebook, but no less telling, and I think it's worth pausing on before we move forward. Thaddeus Purnell, the neighboring hog farmer whose boundary dispute had brought Everett to that hollow in the first place, gave a statement to Sheriff Boone in April of 1896 that goes considerably further than the 2 sentences Boone's official report bothered to summarize. The full statement survives in a separate file, a working notebook Boone kept for his own reference that was never formally filed with the county clerk, and was only rediscovered by Miriam Costello decades later, tucked inside an unrelated box of old tax dispute papers that had simply been mislabeled for 60 years. Purnell told Boone that he had ridden partway onto the disputed acreage himself, twice in the days before Everett vanished, to check on the surveyor's progress, as was his right given his own stake in the boundary dispute, and that both times he had come away with an unease he could not fully account for, and had not, at the time, thought important enough to mention to anyone. The first time, Purnell said, he had watched the 4 hired men working at a distance for perhaps 10 minutes, and had noticed, without quite registering it as strange, until he was riding home afterward, that not one of the 4 men had spoken a single word to another the entire time he watched. Not even the ordinary working chattermen naturally fall into over a shared task, and that when the old man, Elias Tarr, had finally looked up and noticed Purnell watching from the tree line, he didn't wave the way any hired man minding his neighbor's business would, friendly enough. He just looked at me a long moment, and then looked back down at his work, like a man who'd been caught doing something he'd rather not explain, though I couldn't for the life of me say what there was to explain about mending a bit of harness. The second time, 2 days later, Purnell said he had come close enough to hear Everett Coldwell's voice, engaged in what sounded like ordinary friendly conversation with Cassandra Calloway near the fence line, and that he had almost called out a greeting before something stopped him he could not, under Boone's questioning, say precisely what, and instead he sat his horse quietly in the tree line and listened for a moment, and heard Cassandra ask Everett, in a tone Purnell described as gentle, the way you'd talk to a spooked animal you were trying to calm rather than frighten further, whether he still dreamed about his late wife, and how often, and whether the dreams felt, to him, like memory or like something closer, like she was right there in the room with him, close enough to touch, if only he'd reach out. Purnell said Everett had answered, after a pause, that the dreams had gotten closer in recent nights than they'd been in the 2 years since Josephine's death, and that Cassandra had made a small sound at this, not quite a laugh, more like the sound a person makes when a thing they'd hoped for finally starts to come true, and Purnell, without fully understanding why, had turned his horse and ridden home without announcing himself at all. He told Boone, near the end of his statement, something that Boone's official report leaves out entirely and that I think is worth closing this section on. "I have thought on it a good deal since Coldwell went missing, Sheriff, and I want it in the record plain, because I don't expect you to put much stock in it, being a practical man same as myself. But I have known that hollow my whole life, boundary dispute and all, and I have never once, not as a boy, not as a grown man, felt easy on that particular stretch of ground, and I have never been able to say why, only that something in me has always known, the way a horse knows a snake is near before its rider ever sees it, that there is something wrong with that dirt that has nothing to do with the 2 women who happen presently to own it." Boone did not pursue this line of testimony any further. His final report, as I told you, closed the case within 6 weeks, attributing Everett's disappearance to vagrants or rivermen, and Thaddeus Purnell's unsettling first-hand account of watching a woman gently, deliberately reopen a grieving widower's wound in the days before that same widower vanished forever, was never mentioned publicly again by anyone for the better part of 60 years, until Miriam Costello found it filed under the wrong label in a box of tax papers and understood immediately exactly what she was holding. Sheriff Wilkes Boone of Stone County rode out to the Calloway property on the 30th of April, 1896, a day after Thaddeus Purnell reported the missing surveyor and the abandoned horse. Sheriff Boone's own report, filed with the county clerk and preserved, remarkably intact, in the same archive that holds Everett's letters, is a model of careful, uninterested, entirely unhelpful law enforcement, and I think it is worth reading a little of it to you, because the gaps in an official record can tell you as much as the record itself. Boone wrote that he spoke with Delphine and Cassandra Calloway on the property, and that both women confirmed the surveyor had taken supper with them on the evening of the 17th, had stayed the night as their guest owing to the lateness of the hour, and had, to their knowledge, departed early the following morning to continue his work. In good health and good spirits, and expressing his intention to complete the survey within the week, Boone noted that he inspected the property, including, and this is as much detail as the report gives, the outbuildings, and found nothing irregular. He noted that he interviewed the 4 hired men working the property, whose names he recorded as Jedediah Combs, Aaron Sally, a man known only as Buck, and an elderly man named Elias Tarr, and that all 4 corroborated the sisters' account, each independently. Boone closed the file within 6 weeks with a note that reads, in full, "Presumed the deceased man, Coldwell, to have met with misadventure on the road, possibly at the hands of vagrants or rivermen known to travel the county that season, his effects being of some value. No further evidence available. Case closed pending new information." No new information ever came, as far as the official record shows, for 18 years. But here is the part of the story that the sheriff's report does not tell you, because Sheriff Boone, doing his job as he understood it, only ever asked about Everett Coldwell. He never thought to ask a different, better question, which is, how many men, in total, had gone into that hollow and never come back out, going back not just to 1896, but to 1881, when Delphine Calloway first bought that land with $610 in cash that nobody could account for? That number 44 does not come from any single document. It comes from a cross-reference I want to walk you through now, because I think understanding how that number was assembled matters as much as the number itself, and because it took a very particular kind of researcher, working a very long time, to put it together. In 1951, a local historian and schoolteacher named Miriam Costello, working on what she intended to be a modest county history for the Stone County Centennial, began compiling records of transient men drummers, itinerant preachers, hired hands, land agents, surveyors, tinkers, and drifters who had passed through the townships nearest Kissee Mills between 1881 and 1898, and were never afterward accounted for in any county record. No death certificate, no marriage record, no land transaction, no census entry in the following decade, nothing. Men who simply stopped existing, on paper, at some point after they were last seen heading toward or already inside the boundaries of what old maps still labeled Calloway Hollow. Miriam Costello found the first 11 names in county tax rolls and probate filings, men whose families back east or up north had eventually filed to have them declared legally dead so that estates could be settled, land could be sold, widows could remarry. Each filing noted the same basic shape. Last known correspondence from Stone County, Missouri, followed by silence. She found 19 more names cross-referenced in the ledgers of 2 general stores in Kissee, Mills, and Chadwick. Men who had purchased supplies, mentioned their destination to a shopkeeper who wrote it down out of habit or gossip, and were never seen buying supplies again. She found 6 more in newspaper archives. The Springfield papers occasionally running a short item on a missing drummer or vanished land agent. Items that ran once, got no follow-up, and were forgotten. And she found the final 8, bringing her total by 1953, when she quietly stopped publishing her findings in the County Historical Bulletin and, by her own later account to a graduate researcher who tracked her down in 1979, stopped talking about the Hollow altogether, because I had started to feel as though the Hollow had noticed me talking about it, in a source I find, honestly, the most unsettling of the 4. A private ledger, kept by Delphine Calloway herself, recovered from the Calloway house after it was finally sold out of the family in 1912, listing dates, initials, and a single word beside each entry. The word, beside every single one of the 44 names Miriam Costello was eventually able to reconstruct, was the same: kept, not hired, not paid, not departed, or buried, or any of the words you would expect a landowner to use for men who worked her fields and then moved on, the way hired men always eventually move on. Kept 44 times, in a woman's careful, unhurried hand, across 17 years, in a ledger that Delphine Calloway had no evident reason to keep at all, unless she meant, in some private way, to be keeping score. I want to introduce another man, now another name, another disappearance. One I have held back until this point because I think it belongs here, in the middle of the account, where its particular horror can do the most work. His name was Cornelius Fairfax Boland, and he came to Calloway Hollow in the autumn of 1888, 8 years before Everett Coldwell and 4 years before Silas Mercer, and he is the 12th name in Delphine Calloway's ledger, marked, like all the others, with the single word, kept. Boland was different from the men we've spoken of so far in one important respect. He did not come alone, and he did not come poor. He was a well-to-do cattle buyer out of Kansas City, 46 years old, traveling with a hired man named Pico and a string of 11 horses, on his way south to inspect a herd near the Arkansas line, and he stopped at the Calloway place for no more sinister reason than that a broken wagon wheel had stranded him within sight of it. As evening came on, and Miss Delphine, ever gracious, had offered his party the use of her barn and her well while the wheel was mended, everything we know about what happened to Cornelius Boland we know from the hired man, Pico, because Pico, alone among the men who entered that hollow in its worst years, walked back out of it alive and lived another 31 years, and told his story, once, to a Kansas City newspaperman in 1902, 14 years after the fact, in an interview he gave on the condition that it not be published until after his death, a condition the newspaper honored, printing it at last in 1919, the week Pico died of pneumonia at the age of 73. Pico's account is worth hearing because it is the only one we have from a man who was present, awake, and watching. When the hollow reached for someone standing right beside him, and who, for reasons even Pico himself never fully understood, was not the one it reached for. He said that Boland had lost his wife 2 years earlier to a carriage accident, and had grieved her hard and quiet in the way of men who are used to being obeyed and have no idea what to do with a loss they cannot command or purchase their way out of. He said Miss Cassandra had drawn this out of Boland over supper the first night, gently, expertly, the way you draw a splinter, and that by the second night Boland was speaking of his dead wife more openly than Pico had heard him speak of her in the whole 2 years since the accident, describing the way she used to hum while she braided her hair of a morning, a particular tuneless little hum with no melody to it, just a sound she made, a sound Boland said he would give anything at all, to hear one more time. Pico said he woke on the third night to the sound of humming. "I want to be plain about it," Pico told the newspaperman, and the newspaperman printed it plain. "Because I have never told another living soul, and I do not expect to be believed. It was a woman's humming, tuneless, coming from outside the barn where we had bedded down, and Mr. Boland was already sitting up in the dark beside me, and I heard him say his wife's name, Eleanor, in a voice I had never heard him use, not the voice of a hard cattleman at all, but the voice of a boy, small and hoping and afraid to hope, and I put my hand on his arm to stop him, but he had already stood up, and he was walking toward the barn door, toward the humming, and I said his name, and he did not answer. He did not even seem to hear me, and I want it understood that I was afraid, more afraid than I have ever been in my life before or since, and I am ashamed to say that fear is the only reason I did not follow him." Pico said he lay frozen in the dark, listening to Boland's footsteps cross the yard toward the second barn, and listening to the humming, which he said grew not louder as Boland approached it, but somehow closer, more intimate, the way a sound is different when it's meant for you and you alone, rather than just carrying on the air, and that at some point the humming and the footsteps both stopped at the same moment, and the night went entirely silent, and Pico lay in that silence until dawn, without moving, without sleeping, without once working up the courage to go to the barn door and look. In the morning Cornelius Boland was gone. His bedroll was there, his boots were there, his coat was there, the 11 horses were there, and the mended wagon wheel, and every dollar of the considerable sum of money Boland had been carrying to buy cattle with, untouched in his saddlebag. Only the man himself was gone, and the Calloway sisters, when Pico stammered out his question, expressed what he described as a concern so gentle and so complete that I could not for the life of me tell whether it was real or the finest performance I have ever witnessed, and suggested that Mr. Boland must have risen early and wandered off, perhaps confused, perhaps sleepwalking, grief doing strange things to a man, and that Pico ought to search the property, which Pico did for the better part of a day, finding nothing. And here is the part of Pico's account that I have never been able to shake, the part that separates his testimony from every other in this whole record, because Pico, searching the property that day, half mad with fear and grief and guilt, came at last to the fence line along the western tree line, and there, among the Calloway hands mending stone in the morning light, and Pico had counted those hands the first day, out of the same instinct every visitor to that place seemed to develop, and knew them to number 5 there was, that morning, a sixth man, working stone alongside the others, with his back to Pico, of a height and build very near Cornelius Boland's own. "I did not go to him," Pico said. "God forgive me, I did not go to him, and I did not call out, and I did not look at his face, because some part of me that was wiser than the rest of me knew, the way you know a thing in a dream, that if that man turned around and I saw Mr. Boland's face looking back at me out of a stranger's mourning, wearing a stranger's clothes, working a stranger's stone, as though he had done it every day of his life, I knew that if I saw that, I would never again be right in my own mind, not for one single day of whatever life I had left. So I turned my horse, and I left the 11 horses, and the money, and everything that was Mr. Boland's exactly where it lay, because I would not have touched a penny of it to save my own life, and I rode for Kansas City, and I did not stop until the hollow was 3 counties behind me, and I have never gone back, and I have never told this to a soul until now, and I am telling it now only because I am an old man, and I would like, before I die, to have said it out loud one time, so that it is somewhere in the world besides only inside my own head, where it has been eating at me for 14 years. Cornelius Boland was declared legally dead by his brother in 1891. His estate was settled. His 11 horses were eventually recovered from the Calloway place by that same brother, who rode down to Stone County himself, spoke to the sisters, found nothing, and went home. Boland's name sits at the 12th line of Delphine Calloway's ledger, kept in her careful, unhurried hand, and it would have sat there anonymous and unexplained forever, one tally mark among 44, if a frightened hired man named Pico had not carried the memory of a tuneless hum and a 6th man at the fence line for 14 years, and then set it down, at last, on the condition that no one hear it until he was safely dead. We're going to come back to that ledger. We're going to come back to Miriam Costello, too, because her story does not end with a quiet withdrawal from the County Historical Bulletin, and there is a reason her research, unfinished as it was, is the closest thing to a map through this hollow that anyone has ever managed to put together. But first, I want to take you back to 1892, 4 years before Everett Coldwell ever rode south out of Springfield, to a man whose own words are the reason we understand any of this at all. Because somewhere inside that low, wrongly measured barn, or somewhere beneath the floor of the Calloway house, or somewhere in ground that has never once been properly searched, there was a journal. And in 1898, 2 years after Everett vanished, that journal was found. The journal was found in 1898 in a cedar trunk sold at a state auction, when a Calloway relation, a cousin named Orville Calloway, who had inherited a small parcel of adjoining land, cleared out an old smokehouse that had belonged, at one time, to a hired hand's quarters near the eastern fence line, the same fence line Everett Coldwell had once measured and found suspiciously well built. The trunk had a false bottom, a common enough feature in traveling men's trunks of that era, and beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal belonging to a man named Silas Weathers Mercer. Silas Mercer, by the county records Miriam Costello later dug up, was an itinerant Bible salesman and part-time land surveyor's assistant, 26 years old, in 1892, unmarried, originally from Boone County, Kentucky, who had been working his way through the Ozarks for the better part of 2 years, selling family Bibles and household almanacs door to door, a common enough trade for a young man without capital, but with a decent speaking voice and a good horse. His journal begins in January of 1892, ordinary entries about sales made, roads traveled, meals eaten, and it is, frankly, unremarkable reading for its first 140 pages. It becomes remarkable on the entry dated the 3rd of September, 1892, when Silas Mercer, having sold his last Bible in Chadwick and hearing from the same Beckwith family who would warn Everett Coldwell 4 years later that a lady out past Kissee Mills might have need of a hired hand who can also do a bit of surveying work, seeing as her boundaries been in dispute with the Purnell place for going on 2 years now, rode toward Calloway Hollow, believing he had found honest, well-paid work for the coming winter. I want to read you Silas Mercer's own words now, in his own voice, because his journal is the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of what that hollow actually is, written by a man who had, by the time he wrote his final entries, stopped trying to explain it away and started simply trying to survive it. September 4th. Arrived Calloway Place near dusk. 2 sisters, Delphine and Cassandra, own it between them. No husbands, no father spoken of, though a hired man told me later the old man Calloway died some years back, and it's just been the sisters and the land since. Was offered work through the winter, Board and $6 a month. More than fair for this country. Accepted gladly. My horse is tired and so am I, and this seems, God willing, like an easy winter ahead of a hard year. September 9th. Something I should note, though I feel foolish writing it. There is a second barn on this property, smaller than the main one, set back near the tree line, and Miss Delphine has twice now, in the gentlest possible way, made clear that it is not part of my duties, and I have no cause to go inside it. I have not asked why. A man doesn't push at a woman's private business when she's paying his wage. September 21st. The old hired man, Elias, who I gather has been here longer than anyone, told me tonight, and I believe he'd had a bit of whiskey he oughtn't to have had, which is maybe why he told me at all, that a man ought to count the other hands working this place every single morning, first thing, before he does anything else, and keep that number fixed in his head all day, and if the number changes, and he can't account for how, he ought to saddle his horse and not look back, not even for his wages owed. I asked him why, and he went quiet and wouldn't say another word on it, and this is now the third time in 3 weeks somebody in this county has told me some version of the same warning, and I begin to think there is something to it, even though I cannot for the life of me imagine what. October 2nd. Counted 5 men this morning at the well, myself included. Counted 5 again at supper. I confess I am starting to do this without thinking about it now, the way a man counts his own money without meaning to. October 14th. Miss Cassandra asked me tonight, very kindly, whether I had ever lost anyone close to me. I told her about my mother, who died when I was 9, of a fever in the spring, and how I still sometimes catch myself thinking I hear her calling me in from the yard of an evening, the particular way she used to say my name, drawing out the S at the start of it, Silas, like she was starting a song she never finished. Miss Cassandra listened very closely to this, closer than seemed natural for idle supper talk, and asked me to describe the sound of her voice again, in detail, and I did, because I am fond of the memory, and glad, usually, of an excuse to speak of my mother, who I do not get to speak of nearly enough out here on the road. I did not think anything of the conversation until tonight, writing this by candlelight, when I realized I have not been able to stop thinking of it since. November 1st. I heard my mother's voice tonight. I want to write that plainly and not dress it up as a dream, because I do not believe it was a dream. I was near sleep, not fully under, when I heard it, from somewhere outside the bunkhouse, calling my name the way she used to, Silas, drawing it out just so, and I sat bolt upright, and could not for several minutes convince myself it had not been real, and even now, hours later, writing this with my hand not quite steady, I am not entirely convinced. November 9th. Counted 6 men this morning. There have only ever been 5, myself included. I did not recognize the 6th man's face, as he kept his back to me the whole while, working at the fence with the others. But he was of a height and build very near my own, and wearing, I could swear before God, a coat identical to the one I own, the brown wool coat with the mended left elbow that my sister sewed for me 3 winters back, of which I have never seen another like it in this whole country. November 10th. I have decided to leave. I told Miss Delphine this morning that family business calls me back to Kentucky, and I am sorry for the short notice. She did not argue, which surprised me, though Miss Cassandra looked at me a long moment before she said, very softly, "Some ground doesn't like to be left, Silas. You be careful on the road tonight." I do not know what to make of that, and I did not ask. I am packing now. I intend to ride hard for Chadwick before dark. November 10th, later. I could not find my horse. She was tied at the same post I have tied her every night for 2 months, and she is simply gone, lead rope and all, and no one on this place claims to have seen her go, and it is now past 3 in the afternoon, and the light in this hollow starts failing early this time of year, and I do not think I will make Chadwick on foot before dark falls. I am going to try anyway. I am going to walk the fence line east, the stone one, and follow it to the county road, and I am not going to look toward the second barn while I do it, no matter what I hear, because I think I have started to think, these last few weeks, though I have been too much a coward to write it plainly until now, that the second barn is where they keep. The entry ends there, mid-word. There are 4 more pages in Silas Mercer's journal after that entry, and every one of them is blank. Now I want to go back to Silas Mercer for a while, because his journal, which you heard from directly, is not quite the whole of what he left behind, and the rest of it, the part that was not in the journal, the part that had to be reconstructed decades later from other sources, is in some ways more revealing than the journal itself. I told you that Silas Mercer's journal ends mid-word on the 10th of November, 1892, and that the 4 pages following that final entry are blank. What I did not tell you is that the journal was not the only thing found in that false-bottomed cedar trunk in 1898. Beneath the journal, wrapped in the same oilcloth, was a bundle of 11 letters, unsent, addressed to a woman in Boone County, Kentucky, named Prudence Mercer, who was, as Miriam Costello later confirmed through Kentucky County records, Silas Mercer's older sister, the same sister who had sewn him the brown wool coat with the mended left elbow that appears so chillingly in his final journal entries. The letters had never been mailed. They had been written, folded, addressed, and then hidden, and the reason for the hiding becomes clear as you read them in order, because they tell a story the journal only hints at, the story of a man who, in his last weeks at the Calloway place, had begun to understand that he was not going to be allowed to leave, and who had started writing letters home not to be sent, but to be found, someday, by someone, as a record of what had happened to him. The first several letters are ordinary enough, cheerful even, a young man writing to a beloved sister about his good fortune in finding winter work. But the 6th letter, undated but clearly written sometime in late October of 1892, marks a change, and I want to read part of it to you, because Silas Mercer, writing to his sister, allowed himself a kind of plainness he did not allow even his own private journal. Prue, he wrote, I am going to set down something here that I have not the courage to write in my journal, because a journal is a thing a man keeps for himself, and I find I cannot bear to be quite so honest with myself as I can be with you. I do not think this is an ordinary place, Prue. I have started to notice that the men I work alongside do not eat. I have watched them at the noon meal, and they raise the food, and they lower it, and they move their jaws, but I have come to believe, watching close these several days, that they do not actually eat, that it is a performance of eating done for my benefit, or perhaps done out of some habit so old and deep that the performance continues even when there is no one to perform it for. I do not know which of those possibilities frightens me more. The 8th letter is worse. I asked the old man Elias today, plainly, what happened to the man whose place I took, for I have come to understand that there is always a place that has just been vacated when a new hand is hired here, and that the hiring and the vacating are somehow the same event, though I cannot make the arithmetic of it work. Elias would not answer me directly. He only said, and I write it here exactly as he said it, that a man ought not to ask after the fellow whose boots he is filling, because in this hollow, Prue, the boots and the fellow are not so separate a thing as they are elsewhere, and a man who asks too closely after the previous wearer of his boots may find the boots beginning to answer for themselves. I did not understand him. I am not sure I wish to. And the 11th letter, the last one, is the one that I think you have earned the right to hear after everything, because it is the closest thing in this entire record to a man looking his own end in the face and describing it while it approached. Prue, I believe this will be the last of these, whether it is ever found or not. I have understood something tonight that I cannot ununderstand. I heard Mother's voice again, the 3rd night running now, and tonight I did what I have sworn each previous night I would not do. I answered her. I could not help it, Prue. It has been 17 years since she died, and I was 9 years old, and I have missed her every single day of those 17 years. And when a voice calls your name in the dark, in exactly the way your mother called it, drawing out the sound of it just so? The part of you that is 9 years old and misses his mother does not consult the part of you that is a grown man and knows better. I answered her. I said, Mama, out loud into the dark, and Prue, the voice went quiet for a moment, and then it said, gentle as anything, there you are, Silas. I've been looking for you such a long time. And I understood, in that moment, that whatever had just answered me was not my mother, because my mother, God rest her, never in her life had cause to look for me a long time, for I was a boy who never strayed far, and she knew exactly where I was every day of the 9 years she had me. The thing outside knew the sound of her voice. It did not know the truth of her, and knowing that has not saved me, Prue, because I answered anyway, and I think the answering was the thing that mattered, and I do not think it can be taken back. I am going to hide these letters now, and my journal, in the trunk with the false bottom that I bought in Louisville 2 years ago, and I am going to pray that someday someone finds them who is wiser than I was, and counts something, Prue, counts anything at all, and does not answer the voice, no matter how much of a 9-year-old boy is still living inside him. Give my love to everyone. Tell them I was not a coward at the end, or at least that I tried not to be. I remain, always, your loving brother, Silas. That is the last of the 11 letters. Silas Mercer hid them, and his journal, in the false bottom of his cedar trunk, exactly as he said he would. And then, according to the 2-year gap between his final journal entry and Delphine Calloway's ledger notation, something happened to him that took 2 years to finish, and that no surviving document describes, and that I have decided, as Miriam Costello decided before me, I am glad not to know. The letters and the journal sat in that false-bottom trunk for 6 years, through Silas Mercer's disappearance, through the arrival and disappearance of at least 4 more men whose names appear in the ledger between his line and Everett Coldwell's, through Everett's own arrival and disappearance in 1896, until the trunk was sold at a state auction in 1898, and a stranger, cleaning it out, discovered the false bottom and the terrible, patient record hidden beneath it. That stranger, to his lasting credit, did not throw the papers away. He gave them to the county, and they made their slow way through decades of archives and mislabeled boxes until a schoolteacher named Miriam Costello finally read them in the 1950s and understood, at last, that a young Bible salesman who had died before her own mother was born had been trying all that time to warn her. Count something, Silas Mercer wrote to a sister who never received the letter. Count anything at all, and do not answer the voice, no matter how much of a 9-year-old boy is still living inside you. It is, when you strip away everything else, the same advice Orpha Tarr would give 60 years later, and the same advice a librarian in Cassie Mills would hand across a desk to a frightened deer hunter in 2011. The details of that hollow changed. With the decades, the men came on horseback, and then in trucks they came selling Bibles and then hunting deer. But the shape of the thing never changed at all, and neither did the shape of the one defense anyone ever found against it. A number that is yours alone, a refusal to answer, and the terrible, necessary discipline of not turning around. We're a little past the middle of this one now, so let me pause here, just for a moment, before we go on to what happened after that journal surfaced in 1898, because what happened after is, in a lot of ways, the part of this story that took the longest to piece together, and I want you rested for it. Quick reminder while we're paused. This case is one entry in a longer collection I've been putting together called the Ozark Ledger. 10 cases total, just over 9 hours if you listen straight through, and if a case like this one is the kind you'd want more of, that collection's linked below. And if you're still with me at this hour of the night, drop a comment, let me know you made it this far. I read every one. All right, let's get back into it. Because after Silas Mercer's journal was found in 1898, folded into that false-bottomed trunk, it did not stay quiet for long. It found its way, eventually, to exactly the kind of person who could not leave a story like that alone. Her name was Orpha Ruth Tarr, And in 1953, when Miriam Costello, the schoolteacher historian I mentioned earlier, the one who first assembled the number 44, finally worked up the nerve to drive out past Cassie Mills and knock on the door of the last living tar. Still in that country, Orpha was 71 years old, and she had been waiting, she told Miriam plainly, for someone to come ask her about that hollow for the better part of 40 years. Orpha Tarr was the granddaughter of Elias Tarr, the same gray-bearded hired man Everett Coldwell had seen mending harness on his first afternoon at the Calloway place, the same man who had given Silas Mercer his whiskey-loosened warning about counting the hands each morning. Elias Tarr had worked the Calloway land, on and off, for nearly 30 years longer, by a considerable stretch, than any other hired man on record, and when he finally left it for good in 1906, at the age of 68, he did not leave because he was let go, or because the work dried up. He left, Orpha told Miriam, because Delphine Calloway herself, by then an old woman, sat him down one evening and told him plainly that his time of usefulness to her was ending and that he ought to go make what peace he could with his own family before the ground decided it for him instead. She was not unkind about it, Orpha said. And Miriam wrote this down almost verbatim in the notes that survive from that visit. Notes I've drawn from directly for tonight's telling. Grandpa always said that was the strangest part. She thanked him, like he'd done her a real service all those years, keeping count, keeping quiet, keeping the fence mended so nothing wandered out that oughtn't to. He said she looked at him the way you'd look at a good dog going gray around the muzzle. Fond and a little sad, and not the least bit sorry. Elias Tarr came home and told his family almost nothing directly, the same pattern of reluctant, three-part warnings that Otis Beckwith and, before him, Elias himself had given to strangers passing through, except that within his own household, over the following 2 decades, in fragments, late at night, usually after a drink he told himself he wouldn't take, he told his granddaughter Orpha enough that by the time he died in 1928, at the age of 90, Orpha understood better, I think, than almost anyone else alive by that point, exactly what that hollow was, even if she could never fully explain why. Here is what Orpha Tarr told Miriam Costello in 1953, and what Orpha would go on to tell, over the following decades, a handful of other researchers, journalists, and folklorists who eventually found their way to her door, always in more or less the same spare, unadorned language, because Orpha was not a woman given to embellishment, and I think that plainness is exactly why what she said carries the weight it does. Some ground is thick, Orpha said, and some ground is thin. Most folks live their whole lives on thick ground and never have cause to think about the difference. Thick ground holds. It keeps what's dead on one side and what's living on the other the way it's supposed to. But there's places, not many, but they're out there, scattered here and there through these hills where the ground got thin a long time back before anybody living can say how, and once it's thin, it stays thin. Nothing makes it thick again. She said the Calloway sisters had not made that hollow thin. They had found it that way, inherited it, the way Delphine had inherited a strange fortune in cash from a source no one, not even Orpha, could ever fully explain, though Orpha had her suspicions, which she shared carefully, almost reluctantly, and which I'll get to shortly. What the sisters had done, according to Orpha, was learn to use it. Thin ground remembers voices, Orpha said. That's the plain truth of it, best as Grandpa ever explained it to me, and best as I've come to understand it myself, in 70 years of living near enough to that hollow to feel it some nights, even from here. You lose somebody, and you talk about them enough, out loud, in the right place, with the right kind of grief in your voice, real grief, the kind that doesn't perform for anybody, the kind you'd be ashamed for a stranger to overhear, and thin ground listens, and it learns the shape of the voice you lost, and it can wear that shape, for a while, well enough to fool near anybody who wants, badly enough to be fooled. She said the sisters had learned, Over years, and Orpha believed, though she could not prove it, that the sisters themselves were far older than any birth record showed, that Calloway itself might not even have been the name they were born under, that they had perhaps done this in other hollows, under other names, going back further than anyone in that county's memory could reach, how to draw grieving men toward that hollow, and how to let a lonely man's own memory do most of the work of his own undoing, simply by giving him some quiet night, just enough of a voice he missed to make him walk toward the second barn of his own free will. And once Thin Ground's got the shape of you memorized proper, Orpha said, once it's worn your missing person's voice enough times to get good at it, it doesn't much need the sisters anymore to keep going. That's the part folks get wrong when they tell this story. They think Delphine and Cassandra were doing something to those men. Mostly what they were doing was standing back and letting the ground do what Thin Ground does once it's been fed enough grief to know how. Miriam Costello asked her, that first visit, the question everyone eventually asks, what was inside the second barn? Orpha would not answer that question directly, not that visit, nor any visit after, for the better part of 20 years. What she gave instead, both to Miriam in 1953 and, nearly identically, to every researcher who came after, was a second, more specific set of rules, a refinement, she called it, of the old warnings Elias Tarr and Otis Beckwith had passed down in cruder form, rules Orpha herself had tested in her own careful, limited way by walking the edge of that hollow more times than she ever admitted to her own family. First, she said, never say a lost one's name out loud on that ground, not even to yourself, not even in your head if you can help it, because Thin Ground doesn't need your voice to hear you. It just needs the shape of the name sitting in your mind. And if you're standing on ground that thin, when you think it, that's an invitation, same as speaking it. Second, if you hear a voice you recognize, out past where a voice has any business carrying, do not answer it, not with words, not even with a look toward where it came from. A voice that's found the shape of somebody you miss, wants to be recognized more than anything, wants it the way a starving thing wants food, and recognition is the one thing you must never, ever give it, until you are certain past any grief-clouded doubt that the voice is standing in front of you in a body that casts a shadow the sun agrees with. Third, and this is the one Grandpa near the end trusted more than the others, count something, anything, your own steps, the fence posts, the buttons on your coat. It doesn't matter what, so long as it's a number only you know and only you are keeping, out loud if you can manage it, low under your breath. Thin Ground can borrow a voice easy enough. It has a far harder time borrowing a number that's living only inside one particular person's counting, because a number like that isn't grief. It's just arithmetic, and Thin Ground doesn't much care for arithmetic. It's the one human thing Grandpa ever found that it can't easily wear. Miriam Costello, by her own later account, left Orpha Tarr's house that evening in 1953 deeply unsettled and returned 4 more times over the following 2 years, each visit adding a little more to the picture, until, and this is the part of Miriam's own story that I promised I'd come back to, in the autumn of 1955, against Orpha Tarr's direct and repeated advice, Miriam Costello decided to walk the edge of Calloway Hollow herself, alone, at dusk, to see, in her own words, written in a letter to a university folklorist 2 weeks prior, whether a woman who has never lost anyone she truly loved has anything at all to fear from that ground, or whether that protection, if it is protection, only holds for so long. We are going to come back to what happened to Miriam Costello. But first, I need to take you back one more time into the hollow itself, because by 1910, 14 years after Everett Coldwell disappeared, the sisters had a visitor who did not come looking for work or for a boundary survey or for anything so ordinary. He came looking for his brother, and what happened to him is the part of this story where the hollow, for the first time in the whole record, showed itself directly, in daylight, to a man who was watching for it. His name was Garland Coldwell, and he was Everett Coldwell's younger brother, 38 years old in 1910. A schoolteacher by that point in Sedalia, a careful, methodical man by every account that survives of him, and he had spent 14 years, since the spring of 1896, since a letter arrived from the Danvers and Holt survey firm informing the family that Everett had gone missing near Kissee Mills and was presumed, after diligent search, to have met with misadventure on the road quietly, patiently, without ever quite letting go of the conviction that misadventure on the road was not the whole of what had happened to his brother. Garland had read Everett's recovered notebook. The family had been given it, eventually, along with Everett's other effects, and Garland, unlike the sheriff, who filed it away as evidence of nothing in particular, had read that final, unfinished entry, the one about the man in the gray coat, the one that cuts off mid-sentence more times than he could count, until he wrote in his own journal, which does survive and forms the backbone of what I'm about to tell you. I could recite it by heart the way another man might recite a psalm, and I came, over years, to believe it was not the ravings of an exhausted or frightened man, as the sheriff's report implied, but a plain and careful account, cut off before its author could finish it, by something. By 1910, Garland Coldwell had also read through a chain of correspondence with the same Beckwith family in Chadwick, whose granddaughter Garland had written to after tracking down the family from an old newspaper mention enough of the surrounding folklore, including a garbled second-hand account of Silas Mercer's journal, to arrive at Calloway Hollow that October, not as a grieving relative hoping for closure, but as something closer to what Orpha Tarr would later call, admiringly, the only man who ever came through that gate already knowing the rules, and still chose to walk through it anyway. Garland did not stay to supper. He did not accept a bed. He rode in at mid-morning, on a day he had chosen deliberately for its long daylight, and he told Delphine Calloway, by then a woman in her late 50s, still, by every account, appearing far younger than her years, plainly and without preamble, that he had come to see the second barn, and that he intended to see it before dark, and that he had left a letter with the Stone County Sheriff's Office and a second copy with a lawyer in Springfield, to be opened in the event he did not return by the following evening, detailing everything he knew and everyone he suspected. This was new. No one, in 14 years, had ever come to that hollow already armed with the shape of the danger and prepared in advance to make his own disappearance costly to the people who might cause it. Delphine Calloway. By Garland's own account, written that same night in a boarding house in Chadwick, his hands, he noted, still not fully steady as he wrote, studied him for a long moment at the gate, and then said something that I think tells you more about her true nature than almost anything else in this whole record. You're the first one who ever thought to be clever about it, instead of just being sad about it. I confess, I find that almost refreshing. And then she let him in. She did not stop him from walking to the second barn. She walked with him, in fact, unhurried, making what Garland described as unnervingly pleasant conversation about the weather and the year's apple crop, and it was only when they were perhaps 40 yards from the barn door that Cassandra Calloway appeared, from around its far side, and it was only then that Garland Coldwell heard, for the first time, a voice he had spent 14 years trying very hard to forget. It was not Everett's voice. Garland was careful, in his journal, to specify this precisely, because he understood, better than any man who had come before him, exactly what he was dealing with. The voice that called his name from somewhere near that barn's shadowed side was his mother's voice, dead 11 years by 1910, a woman Garland had grieved deeply and quietly, the way careful men often do, calling him the particular pet name she alone had used for him as a boy, a name Garland had not heard spoken aloud by another living soul in over a decade, and had certainly never once written down or spoken to a stranger in all his careful correspondence building up to this visit. He did not answer it. He did not even turn his head fully toward it. He kept walking, and under his breath, audible enough that Cassandra Calloway, standing close beside him by then, clearly heard it. His journal notes, Her expression changed when she realized what he was doing. Garland Coldwell began, quietly, steadily, to count. He counted fence posts. He had counted them, methodically, the entire walk in from the gate, a number that was his and his alone, that he kept running under his breath, even as his mother's voice called to him a second time, "Closer now," with a small catch in it, a particular small catch Garland's own mother used to get in her voice when she was worried for him, a detail so exact that he wrote, "I felt my resolve waver in a way I am not proud of," and I believe it was only the number I was at, 111 fence posts by then, I remember the number precisely even now, that kept my feet moving forward instead of turning toward that voice, the way every part of me, not currently occupied with counting, wanted desperately to turn. At the barn door, Delphine Calloway stopped him. Not with force, Garland was careful to note this too, that at no point did either sister lay a hand on him or bar his path, but with words, spoken, he wrote, not as a threat, but as what I can only describe as a genuine, almost sisterly warning, delivered with what seemed to be real concern for my well-being, which unsettled me a very great deal more than open hostility would have. "You don't want to open that door, Mr. Coldwell," Delphine said. "Not because I'll stop you, I won't, but because there is a difference between knowing a thing in your head, the way you've clearly worked very hard to know it, and seeing it laid out plain in front of your eyes. Your brother knew, at the end. He worked it out, same as you have. And knowing it plain didn't save him one bit of the grief of seeing it. I'd spare you that, if you'll let me. That's not a threat. That's the only kindness I've got to offer a man clever enough to walk in here the way you did." Garland Coldwell did not open the door. He wrote, that night, with what reads as genuine and lasting regret, that he stood at that threshold for what he judged to be nearly a full minute, his hand actually resting on the barn's latch, his own counted number. He had reached 146 fence posts, and had begun standing still, counting his own heartbeats, instead, to keep the thread unbroken, the only thing standing between him and whatever his brother had seen in the last moments before his final journal entry cut off mid-word. And then he took his hand off the latch, and turned, and walked back to the gate, and rode for Chadwick, and never returned to Stone County again for the remaining 31 years of his life. He did not consider this a victory. He wrote, in the final entry of his own journal concerning the matter, dated some years later, "I have turned this decision over 10,000 times since, and I cannot say even now whether I showed wisdom that day, or simply cowardice dressed up as wisdom after the fact, because a braver or more foolish man might have opened that door and found some way to bring Everett home, or at least brought home the plain, unbearable truth of what became of him, instead of the endless, gnawing uncertainty I have carried in its place ever since. I only know that something in that woman's voice, and something in the particular careful concern with which she delivered her warning, convinced me, in that moment, that whatever lay past that door was not a truth a living man was meant to carry back out with him. And so I left it there, and I have never once, in all the years since, been entirely at peace with having done so. Garland Coldwell's journal is where the second structure detail comes from, the one detail I think matters more than almost any other in piecing together what that hollow actually was, and I saved it for now, because I think, after everything else, you're ready to hear it properly. On his walk out, shaken, moving quickly toward the gate, Garland passed close by a stand of cedar trees, roughly 80 yards northwest of the second barn, ground he had not crossed on his way in, and there, half hidden in the deep shade, he saw what he described as a low structure, not a full building, more a kind of open framework of old timber, weathered gray, arranged in a rough circle perhaps 20 feet across, with the ground inside it worn bare and hard-packed in a way that suggested regular use, and cut into several of the upright timbers, at roughly the height of a standing man's chest, a series of marks, not letters I recognized. Not any alphabet I have ever seen in any book, but deliberate, repeated shapes, tallied in rows, the way a man might tally a count of something on a barn wall, except there were, by my hurried and frightened count as I passed, considerably more than 44 of them. He did not stop to count precisely. He did not go closer. He rode on to the gate and to Chadwick and to the rest of his long, careful, unsettled life. But that number, considerably more than 44, cut into cedar posts in a language no scholar has ever been able to place, in a hidden circle of ground, 80 yards from a barn that measures smaller inside than out, is the reason I do not think 44 is really the whole of this story, either. I think 44 is only the number that could be proven, on paper, in county records, by researchers like Miriam Costello working forward from documents that happened to survive. I think the real number, the one cut into that cedar, going back further than any deed or ledger the Stone County Recorder's Office ever kept, is something else entirely, and something we will likely never know. There is a question I have been circling around this entire time, and I think it is time to ask it directly, because it is the question every person who has ever studied this case eventually arrives at, and it is the question that has no comfortable answer. What, exactly, happened to the men who were kept? Where did they go? What were they, standing at that fence line the morning after, wearing the coats of the men they had been the night before? I want to be honest with you. Nobody knows. Orpha Tarr, who understood that hollow better than anyone, refused to answer this question directly for the last 20 years of her life. And I have come to believe her refusal was not evasion but wisdom, because I think the honest answer is that the question itself is built on an assumption that does not hold in that place, the assumption that a person is one thing in one place that can be tracked from a before to an after. In Calloway Hollow, that assumption seems simply not to apply, and every attempt to reason about the fate of the kept men founders on it. But I can tell you what the various people who studied this case came to believe, and I can let you weigh their theories for yourself, because I think that is the most honest thing I can do with a mystery this old and this deep. Orpha Tarr's grandfather, Elias, who worked that land for 30 years and left it alive, believed, according to what Orpha passed down, that the men were not killed at all, not in any sense he could recognize as killing. He believed they were taken into the ground, into the thin ground itself, and that the ground kept them the way a cellar keeps preserves, whole and unchanged and somehow still present, and that the figures who appeared at the fence line wearing their coats were not the men themselves, but the ground wearing the shape of them, the way it wore the shape of their voices, a kind of impersonation made not of sound but of flesh, or of something that stood in for flesh well enough to fool a surveyor's count. Elias believed, Orpha said, that on certain nights, if you stood at the edge of that hollow and listened, you could hear all of them at once, all the kept men counting together in the dark beneath the ground, and that the counting never stopped and never reached any number, and had been going on down there since long before the Calloway sisters ever arrived to learn how to feed it. Miriam Costello, the historian, being a more modern and more skeptical woman, resisted this cosmology for many years, and tried, in her private papers, to construct explanations that did not require thin ground, or impersonating dirt theories, involving the sisters as ordinary if prolific murderers, disposing of bodies in ways that simply were never found, the folklore accreting around a mundane if terrible crime the way folklore does. But she could never make those theories account for the things that had to be accounted for. The sixth man Pico saw at the fence line the morning after Boland vanished, the fifth man wearing Everett's own coat in Everett's own final entry, the footprints that walked back 4 inches longer in the stride, her own mother's voice calling her by a name no living person knew. In the end, near the end of her life, Miriam wrote a single sentence in her notes that I think represents her final position after 50 years of study. I have spent my life trying to find the ordinary crime hidden inside this extraordinary story, and I have failed, and I have come to believe I failed because there is no ordinary crime hidden inside it, and never was, and the extraordinary story is simply the true one, however much that truth offends everything I was trained to believe. And Wendell Cross, the folklorist who inherited the watching from Orpha Tar and carried it for 41 years, arrived at yet a third position, one I find in some ways the most unsettling of the three, precisely because it is the most modest. Cross believed that it did not matter, finally, what the kept men became, or where they went, or what stood at the fence line wearing their coats. What mattered, he wrote in the one careful academic paper he ever published on the subject, disguised behind pseudonyms so thorough that only 3 people alive can now identify what county it describes, was that the mechanism was reliable, repeatable, and still functioning. Whatever the ontological status of the entity or the location, Cross wrote, in the flat, careful language of a scholar trying very hard not to sound frightened, the operational reality is that a grieving person brought onto that specific ground and encouraged to vocalize their grief for a specific lost individual will, within a small number of nights, begin to perceive that individual's voice and will, absent specific and difficult countermeasures, act on that perception in ways that reliably result in their disappearance and their non-recovery. This has been documented in forms ranging from contemporaneous journals to sworn testimony to living witnesses across a span of at least 130 years, with no meaningful variation in the pattern. Whatever it is, it works, and it is still there, and it is still working, and the only responsible thing a person who understands this can do is to ensure, by whatever quiet means are available, that grieving people are kept away from that ground. That was the whole of Wendell Cross's life's work, in the end. Not to explain the hollow, not to defeat it, or expose it, or study it into submission. Simply to keep people away from it, the way Orpha Tar had, and Elias Tar before her. A quiet, unbroken line of watchers stretching back over a century, each one understanding that the thing could not be stopped, only starved, and that starving it meant, in practice, an endless patient vigilance against the one thing that fed it. A grieving person, standing on thin ground, saying a lost name out loud into the dark. There is a chapter of this story I have not told you, and it is the one that brings the count of documented cases closer to complete, because it concerns not one man but 3 who came to that hollow together in the spring of 1891, and whose fate is the only instance in the entire record of the hollow taking more than one person from a single group, and of one member of that group doing something no one else ever did. They were brothers, the Hargrove brothers out of Arkansas. Amos the eldest, 34, Wiley the middle, 30, and the youngest, a boy really, named Josiah, just 19. They were horse traders, and they came up into Missouri in the spring of 1891 following the horse fairs, and they stopped at the Calloway place because they had heard from the same network of rumor and warning that touched everyone who came near that hollow that a woman out past Kissee Mills sometimes had horses to sell, and they were, above all things, always looking for horses. What made the Hargrove brothers different, and what makes their story the strangest variation in the whole record, is that all 3 of them shared a single grief. Their mother had died the previous winter, all 3 of them present at her deathbed, and they were traveling that spring in the raw early stage of a loss they had not begun to process, 3 grown men bound together by the very fresh absence of the one woman who had raised them alone after their father died young. The hollow, according to the reconstruction Miriam Castello eventually assembled from a Hargrove family descendant who still had letters and family memory, did to the brothers exactly what it did to every grieving person who lingered there. It began, within a few nights, to give them back their mother's voice. But here is the variation, the thing that happened with the Hargroves and never, as far as we know, with anyone else. Because there were 3 of them, and because they were brothers who trusted each other completely, they compared notes. Amos heard their mother first, on the second night, and said nothing, ashamed, thinking himself half mad with grief. Wiley heard her the third night, and also said nothing, for the same reason. It was young Josiah, the 19-year-old, who broke the silence on the fourth morning, saying, over breakfast, in a small voice, that he thought he was losing his mind because he had heard Mama calling him in the night. And Amos went very still, and Wiley went very still, and the three brothers looked at each other across a breakfast table in a hollow in Missouri and understood all at once that they were not each going mad in private. They were all hearing the same thing, and that shared understanding, the simple fact of three witnesses comparing an experience that isolation would have made unbearable and unspeakable, did something the hollow had never had to contend with before. It broke the spell of shame and secrecy that the hollow depended on. Because grief kept private is grief the hollow can use. But grief spoken aloud between three brothers who trust each other becomes something else. It becomes a shared problem to be faced, rather than a private madness to be hidden and, ultimately, obeyed. The Hargroves decided that fourth morning to leave together, immediately, in daylight, and to keep talking the whole way out, to say out loud to each other, constantly, that the voice was not their mother, that their mother was dead and buried in Arkansas, and had never in her life set foot in Missouri, and that whatever was calling to them was a liar wearing her sound. They spoke this to each other, the family memory holds. The entire time they saddled their horses and packed their gear, three grown men reminding each other over and over of a truth that each of them, alone, might not have been able to hold on to. And it nearly worked. It nearly worked completely. The three brothers rode out together, talking, holding the truth between them like a rope, and they made it almost to the gate. But the hollow, which had a century of practice at finding the weak point in any defense, found the weak point in theirs, and the weak point was the youngest, Josiah, 19, who had been closest to their mother, who had been the baby, who had sat by her bed to the very last, when the older two had had to step out because they could not bear it. Josiah's horse, the family memory holds, came up lame near the gate, a stone in the shoe perhaps, or perhaps something else, and Josiah, being young and being the best of them with horses, told his brothers to ride onto the gate, and he would deal with the stone and catch them up in a moment. It was nothing. Go on ahead. And Amos and Wiley, 40 feet ahead, at the very gate, with freedom in sight, turned to wait for their little brother, and in the moment they turned, in the moment their attention went back toward the hollow to check on Josiah, they heard their mother's voice, close, clear, calling not to them, but to Josiah, calling him by the pet name she had used for her baby, calling, Joey, Joey, don't you leave your mama here all alone. And they saw Josiah, kneeling by his horse's hoof, go absolutely still. Amos Hargrove did the thing that no one else in this entire record ever did. He did not count. He did not flee. He did not hold the line and save himself. He got off his horse, at the gate, with freedom one step away, and he walked back into the hollow toward his little brother, calling Josiah's name, and Wiley followed him, because they were not going to leave their brother, whatever it cost, and the cost, in the end, was everything. The family memory, and Miriam Costello's reconstruction, is that none of the three Hargrove brothers ever came out of that hollow. Their horses were found, days later, along the county road, in the pattern that by now you know too well. And the Hargrove descendant who preserved the family memory told Miriam something that I think is the truest and saddest thing anyone ever said about that place. The story in our family was always that the hollow got all three of them because it couldn't get any one of them, because the only thing stronger than what that place used against people was the thing that made Amos turn. And the terrible joke of it, the thing that's haunted our family for 4 generations, is that the very thing that should have saved them, that they loved each other too much to leave one behind, is the exact thing the hollow used to take all three. It couldn't break their love for their mother into something that would destroy them one at a time. So it used their love for each other instead. It knew Amos would come back for Josiah. It counted on it. It had 100 years to learn that the surest way to catch a man who won't be caught alone is to catch someone he loves first, and wait. 3 names in the ledger, that spring of 1891, in Delphine Calloway's careful hand. Amos, Wiley, and Josiah Hargrove. Kept, and beside the youngest, Josiah, alone among all 44 entries in that entire ledger, Delphine wrote one additional word, which Miriam Costello found and never fully forgave the hollow for, a word that suggests that even Delphine, even the farmer of that terrible ground, understood exactly what she had watched happen at her own gate that spring morning. Beside Josiah Hargrove's name, she wrote, "Kept," and his brothers, for love of him, a pity, as though she were sorry, as though a woman who had fed that ground for a decade could stand at her window and watch two brothers walk back through her gate to die for love of a third, and feel, genuinely, that it was a pity, and feel nothing else that might have made her open her mouth and call out a warning, and mean it in time. If you've stuck with me this deep into the dark, drop a fire emoji in the comments so I know to keep going. We're heading into the last stretch now. Miriam Costello was 34 years old in the autumn of 1955, unmarried by her own description in later interviews, married instead to the county's dusty back rooms and its stubborn old women, and she had, over 2 years of careful, patient visits to Orpha Tarr, come to believe wrongly, as she would nearly learn at terrible cost, that a woman who had never lost anyone she deeply loved might walk the edge of that hollow at dusk with something close to impunity, simply to see, firsthand, what generations of second-hand testimony could only describe at one remove. Orpha Tarr told her not to go. Orpha told her, in fact, more directly than she had told her anything in 2 years of careful, folkloric hedging, that grief was not the only door thin ground could open, that curiosity itself, held closely enough, turned over enough times in a person's private thoughts, could serve nearly as well as grief, given the right kind of ground and the right kind of patience, and that Miriam's 2 years of near-obsessive research into that hollow's history had, in Orpha's considered opinion, worn a groove in your thinking that ground like that can find just as easy as it finds a groove worn by mourning. Miriam went anyway, on the evening of the 11th of October, 1955, parking her car on the county road a half-mile out and walking in on foot as the light started to go long and gold, and then, more quickly than she expected, gray. What happened next, we know only from Miriam Costello's own account, given to Orpha Tarr that same night, close to midnight, when Miriam arrived at Orpha's door on foot, having abandoned her car on the county road, her dress torn at one sleeve, her hands scraped raw, and did not fully calm enough to speak coherently. For nearly 2 hours an account Orpha wrote down in careful longhand the following morning, while it was still fresh in both our memories, because I have learned, over a long life near that ground, that a person's memory of a bad night in that hollow has a way of softening and reshaping itself if you wait too long to fix it on paper. Miriam had walked the fence line, by her account, for perhaps 20 minutes without incident, taking notes, sketching the stonework, doing exactly the kind of careful documentary work she had spent 2 years training herself to do. It was full dusk, the light gone the particular gray-gold color Everett Coldwell had once written about, when she first heard, from somewhere past the fence, a voice she did not, at first, recognize as anything but an ordinary woman's voice, calling out what she took to be a greeting. It was only on the second call that Miriam recognized it. With a jolt she described to Orpha as like missing a step in the dark, as her own mother's voice, dead 6 years by 1955, calling her by a childhood nickname, Mimi, that Miriam had not heard spoken aloud since her mother's funeral, and had certainly never once mentioned in 2 full years of careful conversation to Orpha Tarr or anyone else connected to that hollow. Miriam had believed, going in, that she had no deep grief for that ground to find purchase on. She was wrong, and she knew it instantly. Standing at that fence line in the failing light, in a way that frightened her, she told Orpha, almost more than the voice itself did the realization, all at once, of exactly how much of my mother I had been carrying quietly all along, without ever quite admitting to myself how much her loss still sat in me. She did not have Orpha's third rule fixed firmly enough in her mind. That is the honest, unflattering truth of what nearly happened next, and Miriam herself insisted, when she finally told this story to later researchers over the following decades, that it be told honestly, without softening her own failure in the moment, because she believed rightly, "I think that the honest telling was more useful to the next person who might find themselves in that same position than a tidier version would be." She answered the voice. Not with words, she had at least held on to that much of Orpha's warning, but she turned, fully, toward the sound, toward the tree line past the fence, where the voice seemed to be coming from, and she took, by her own later count, worked out carefully afterward with Orpha's help, either 3 or 4 full steps toward the fence itself, before some other, older, more animal part of her mind, not her training, not her careful 2 years of folklore research, but something further down, she said. Something closer to instinct than intellect made her look, instead, at her own hands. She was, at the time, wearing a wristwatch, a gift from her late mother, in fact, which she had worn every day for 6 years, without once thinking of it as anything other than a piece of jewelry with sentimental weight. In the gray light, glancing down at her own hands as she took that 3rd or 4th step toward the fence, she saw the second hand of that watch, still ticking, still moving, in its ordinary mechanical rhythm, and something in that small, stupid mechanical fact, the plain, unglamorous arithmetic of a second hand doing exactly what a second hand is built to do, snapped her, all at once, back into herself. She began to count the ticks. Out loud, she told Orpha, though she could not afterward say for certain whether she had actually spoken or only mouthed the numbers, gripping that watch in both hands, hard enough to leave a mark in her palm that was still visible, faintly, when she showed Orpha 2 hours later. 1, 2, 3, 4, on and on, fixed entirely on the small mechanical certainty of a second hand ticking forward, refusing, with everything she had left, to let her mother's voice, which continued calling to her, she said, for what felt like a very long time, though the watch would later suggest it had been less than 90 seconds in total, pull her attention back toward the fence. She turned and walked. Not ran. She was careful to specify this to Orpha, because she believed, and Orpha agreed, that running might have been the more dangerous choice, might have signaled a kind of panic that thin ground, in Orpha's careful theory of the place, could read as easily as it read grief. She walked, counting, all the way back to her car, and only once she was inside it, doors locked, engine running, did she allow herself to stop counting and to cry. For the first time in 6 years, the way she had not let herself cry at her own mother's funeral. She drove straight to Orpha Tarr's house rather than home to her own, because, she told Orpha, I did not trust myself to be alone that night, not yet, not until I'd said all of it out loud to somebody who'd understand exactly what I meant. Miriam Costello never went near Calloway Hollow again. She continued her historical research on the county from a safe distance for another decade, publishing carefully, cautiously, always leaving certain details deliberately vague, and she and Orpha Tarr remained close. In the particular quiet way of 2 women who have shared something neither of them can fully explain to anyone else until Orpha's death in 1976, at the age of 94, an unusually long life. Miriam noted more than once in later years, for a woman who had spent so much of it standing, deliberately, at the very edge of ground, that thin. Delphine Calloway died in 1911 at what the county death record lists, almost certainly inaccurately given everything else we've discussed tonight, as 68 years of age. Cassandra Calloway, her sister, sold the property the following year, in 1912, to a timber company out of Springfield for $4,000, a considerable sum for that acreage at the time, and then, according to every record Miriam Costello was ever able to find, simply left the state of Missouri entirely and was never traced again under the Calloway name in any subsequent census, marriage record, or death certificate anywhere in the country. The timber company logged roughly 1/3 of the property over the following 6 years, and then, abruptly, in 1918, stopped work entirely, and sold the land at a considerable loss to a local farming family named Pruitt, who held it for 11 years before selling it again in 1929 to another family, and then again in 1941, and again in 1958, a pattern of unusually frequent turnover that Miriam Costello noted in her private papers, without ever quite drawing the obvious conclusion in print, because, she wrote, some conclusions are easier to live with, unspoken. Every family that owned that parcel between 1912 and the present day has, without exception, according to county tax records, fenced off and posted the section of land containing the 2 barns and the cedar stand as off-limits, even to their own hired hands, a restriction that appears in the property's deed language itself unusually as a specific carved-out easement dating back to the original 1912 sale language that the timber company's own lawyers' records show, insisted on including, though no surviving document explains why a timber company in 1912 would care to permanently restrict access to 12 acres of unremarkable hill ground in the middle of a much larger timber tract they had just paid good money to log. The second barn, the one that measures smaller inside than out, the one neither Everett Coldwell nor Silas Mercer nor Garland Coldwell ever fully entered and lived to describe, still stands today, or did, as of the most recent aerial survey I was able to find, filed with the county assessor's office in 2019. It appears in that survey as a small gray rectangle, roofline sagging, well within the fenced-off easement, on land that has been owned since 2003 by a limited liability company registered in Delaware, whose ownership records, filed with the Missouri Secretary of State, list only a registered agent's office in Jefferson City and no individual human names at all. I want to sit with that fact for a moment because I think it's worth sitting with. A piece of land that has changed hands 7 times in 140 years, that no owner in that entire span has ever developed, farmed, logged further, or in any way used, that every single owner has gone out of their way to fence off and legally restrict even from their own hired help, is currently owned by a corporate shell entity with no visible human face attached to it at all. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure anyone alive does. But I don't think it means nothing. The Cedar Circle Garland Coldwell described in 1910 the ring of weathered timber posts carved with marks no scholar has ever identified, the count that ran, by his hurried and frightened estimate, to considerably more than 44, has never been formally surveyed, catalogued, or studied by any historical or archaeological body as far as any public record shows. A graduate student from the University of Missouri did attempt, in 1981, to secure permission from the then owners to survey the site for a thesis on Ozark folk architecture. Permission was denied in a 1-line letter that survives in that student's own papers, now archived at the university, reading only, "Some ground is better left uncounted. Please do not ask again." That letter was signed, simply, "The current owners." No name. I want to bring this a little closer to the present before we go back to Delphine Calloway's own strange origins, because the most recent first-hand account connected to that hollow is not from the 1890s or the 1950s. It's from 2011, and the man at the center of it is, as of this recording, still alive, though he has asked, in every interview he's given, that his real name not be used, and I intend to honor that, the way the local paper that first covered his story did, referring to him only by the initials he chose himself, R.T. R.T. It was 39 years old in November of 2011, a deer hunter from Christian County who had, by his own account, no knowledge whatsoever of the Calloway Hollow stories. He had simply followed a wounded buck across a property line he did not realize was posted, in thick brush, in failing light, on the second day of rifle season, and found himself, as dusk came down, standing at the edge of a low gray barn he did not recognize. On land that felt, he told the paper 2 years later, once he'd finally worked up the nerve to talk about it publicly, wrong in a way I still can't properly describe to somebody who wasn't standing there. too quiet. Even for deep woods in November, which gets quiet, sure, but this was a different kind of quiet, like the woods themselves were waiting on something. R.T. said he heard, from somewhere near that barn, a child's voice, his own daughter's voice, he was certain of it, a girl who was, at that time, safely at home with her mother, 40 minutes away, a fact he confirmed by cell phone the moment he was close enough to a signal to make the call. Hands shaking so badly, he said, that he could barely hold the phone to his ear, calling out, "Daddy?" in a tone of genuine, small child worry that he said hit him somewhere lower than my brain, somewhere in my chest. Before I even had time to think about whether it made sense, my legs were already moving toward that barn. He does not fully remember stopping himself. He told the paper, and later a folklore podcast that tracked him down in 2017, that the thing that broke the pull, as best he can reconstruct it, was his rifle's serial number, an odd, almost absurd detail, but one he has repeated consistently across every telling, which lends it, I think, a certain weight. He had, out of long habit from years of hunting, memorized his own rifle's serial number, the way some men memorize a phone number, and in the moment his hand brushed the stock of that rifle, slung over his shoulder, some part of him, unbidden, began silently reciting those digits over and over, and he says that reciting them a fixed, meaningless, entirely his own string of numbers was the only thing that let him notice, with a kind of sick, dawning horror, that his own feet had carried him nearly to the barn door without his conscious permission at all. He ran. He does not remember most of the run back to his truck, only that he did not stop reciting that serial number the entire way, and that he called his wife again, sobbing, the moment he reached cell signal near the county road, and made her put their daughter on the phone, immediately, just to hear her actual voice, safe at home 40 minutes away, saying nothing more remarkable than that she was hungry and wanted to know when he'd be back for supper. R.T. reported the encounter to the Stone County Sheriff's Department the following day, who logged it, according to public records obtained by the same local paper, as a simple trespassing and lost hunter matter, with no mention of anything unusual in the official incident report. A pattern, by now, you'll notice, that runs consistently through every official document connected to that hollow going all the way back to 1896. I said earlier that Garland Coldwell, Everett's brother, was the only man who ever walked into that hollow already knowing the rules and chose to walk in anyway, and that he walked back out again, marked but alive. I want to return to Garland now, because his life after that day in 1910 is its own quiet testament to what the hollow does to the people it does not manage to keep, and because there is a coda to his story that I have saved, deliberately, for near the end. Garland lived another 31 years after standing at that barn door with his hand on the latch and his own mother's voice in his ears, and choosing against everything in him to take his hand off the latch and walk away. He went home to Sedalia, and he went back to teaching school, and by every account of the people who knew him, he was a good teacher and a decent man, and a person that something had, very obviously, happened to, though he never spoke of what. His students, decades later, when they were old people themselves, being interviewed by the same graduate researchers who eventually pieced this whole account together, remembered Mr. Coldwell as a kind but distant man with one striking habit. He counted. He counted constantly, quietly, under his breath, all day long. He counted the students as they filed into the classroom each morning, and again after each recess, and again before dismissal. And if the number was ever off, if a child was absent, or had slipped out to the privy, the other students remembered that Mr. Coldwell would go very still, and would not resume the lesson, would not do anything at all, until every single child was accounted for and the number was whole again. They thought, as children do, that it was simply an eccentricity, that Mr. Coldwell was unusually strict about attendance. Only one of them, a woman named Hazel, who was 91 when she was interviewed in 1988, understood, in retrospect, what she had been watching. He wasn't strict about attendance, Hazel said. I understood that later, much later, after I'd read some of what came out about his brother. He was afraid. Every single day of his life, that man was afraid, in a quiet way that never once let up. That if he lost count of us, if his number ever came up wrong, and he didn't fix it, something would happen. I don't think he even knew what he thought would happen. I think he'd just learned, somewhere, once, that keeping count was the thing that kept the world in its right shape, and he never once, in all the years I knew him, let himself stop. Garland Coldwell married late, at 49, a widow named Ada, and by all accounts, they were happy, in the muted way of two people who have each survived something. He never had children of his own, and Hazel, among others, believed this was a choice and believed she understood the reason for it, though Garland never said, "I think," Hazel said, that a man who spends his whole life terrified of losing count doesn't dare take on more to count than he has to. I think loving Ada was as much as he could bear to be responsible for. A child would have been one more number he couldn't stand to lose, and I think he knew himself well enough to know he couldn't have borne it. Garland Coldwell died in 1941, at the age of 69, of heart failure, in his sleep, in Sedalia, 31 years and some months after the day he took his hand off that barn latch. And here is the coda I saved, the thing found among his effects that his widow Ada gave to Everett and Garland's surviving sister, who kept it and whose descendants eventually gave it to the same archive that holds so much of the rest of this account. It was a letter, sealed, addressed in Garland's hand to his brother Everett, to a man who had been missing, presumed dead, for 45 years by the time Garland wrote it. It was dated 1939, 2 years before Garland's own death, and it had never been sent because, of course, there was nowhere to send it. It was simply written and sealed and kept, the way Silas Mercer's letters to his sister had been written and kept, a message with no possible recipient set down, because the alternative was to carry it unsaid. Everett, it read, I am 67 years old as I write this, and I have carried you with me every day since I was 38 and stood at that barn door and did not open it. I want to tell you, brother, in case it matters, in case any part of you is anywhere that this could reach, I heard Mother that day. She called me Gilly, the way she did when we were small, and there is no one alive who knows she called me that, and I did not answer her, and I counted fence posts instead, and I have wondered every day since whether I chose rightly or whether I abandoned you a second time by walking away. I have decided, these last years, to believe that you would have wanted me to walk away. I have decided to believe that if you could have called out to me, truly you, the real you, and not the thing that wore Mother's voice, you would have said the same thing I said to my own students every day of my life. Keep the count, and don't come looking for the one that's missing, and get yourself home. I hope I chose the way you'd have wanted. I have never been sure. I remain, until I see you again if I ever do, your brother, who counted his way through 50 years without you, and never once got the number to come out right. Gilly. That letter was found in 1941. Everett Coldwell had been gone 45 years by then. He is, as far as any record shows, gone still one name among 44 in a dead woman's ledger, and one name among considerably more than 44 cut into cedar posts in a language no one can read, in a hollow that is still, as of this recording, owned by no one with a face. But R.T., unlike Sheriff Boone's incident report, did one more thing before he left that county road for good. He went, on a hunch he still cannot fully explain, to the local library in Cassee Mills, and asked the librarian on duty, an older woman, as it happened, who had grown up in that county and had heard the old stories from her own grandmother, whether there was anything on record about that stretch of land past the old Purnell boundary. The librarian, R.T. said, did not look surprised by the question. She simply reached under the front desk, pulled out a thin manila folder she had apparently kept there, unlabeled, for exactly this purpose, and set it in front of him without a word. Inside were photocopies of newspaper clippings going back decades, a hand-drawn map of the property with the fence line and both barns marked, and a single typed page unsigned, listing in a format RT. Immediately recognized from what he read in that folder as consistent with everything else in this case, a set of 3 rules. Do your work in daylight. Decline what's offered, however politely it's pressed, and count something that's entirely your own. I told you earlier that Delphine Calloway bought that hollow in 1881 for $610, paid in full, in cash, by a woman who had never before held a bank account in her own name. I want to go back to that detail now, because it is, in some ways, the loosest thread in this whole account, and I think a story like this one owes you its loose threads as honestly as it owes you its resolved ones. No one, not Miriam Costello, not the graduate researchers who came after her, not the County Historical Society, which has, over the decades, made more than one quiet attempt to trace the Calloway family back further than 1881, has ever been able to determine where Delphine and Cassandra Calloway came from before that year. There is no record of either woman in any Missouri census prior to 1880. There is no marriage record, no birth record, no church record in any county bordering Stone that Miriam was ever able to locate under the name Calloway or under any of the 4 or 5 alternate spellings a records clerk of that era might plausibly have used. What Miriam did find, after years of patient searching, was a single, tantalizing reference in the personal diary of a circuit-riding preacher named the Reverend Josiah Pemberton, who kept meticulous notes on every family in his territory between 1860 and his death in 1883. In an entry dated the autumn of 1879, 2 years before Delphine's land purchase, Pemberton makes a brief, puzzling note about 2 sisters, strangers to this county, lodging some weeks now at the old Purnell tenant house, keeping much to themselves and asking, oddly, after any local families who might recently have lost a son or husband to illness or accident, ostensibly, they say, out of Christian charity, though I confess their questions struck me as more curious than charitable, and I did not care for the particular attention with which the elder of the 2 listened to my answers. That is the entire entry. Pemberton never mentions the sisters again in any surviving portion of his diary, and no other document places them anywhere in that county before Delphine's cash purchase. 18 months later, a purchase made, notably, only a few months after the Reverend Pemberton himself died suddenly, of causes his own church listed simply as a seizure of the heart, sudden and without warning, in the 61st year of his life. A death that, I want to be careful to say, has never been connected to the Calloway sisters by any evidence beyond timing, and timing alone is a thin thread to hang any accusation on. I raise it only because I think, in a story built almost entirely out of thin threads, it would be dishonest of me to leave this particular one out simply because it doesn't resolve into anything conclusive. Orpha Tarr, for her part, believed again, by her own admission, without proof, only the accumulated instinct of a woman who had spent 70 years living near that ground, that the sisters had done this before, elsewhere, under other names, in other hollows, in other states, going back further than anyone then living could trace, and that Calloway Hollow was simply the most recent chapter of something considerably older than Stone County itself. Thin ground doesn't grow sisters like that on its own, she told Miriam once, in an aside Miriam recorded almost as an afterthought in her 1954 notes. Something has to come find it and learn to work it, same as a farmer has to come find good bottomland and learn its particular ways before it'll really produce for him. I don't believe those 2 were the first tenants that ground ever had, and I don't believe, God help us, that they were the last, either not entirely, not if that company that owns it now is what I suspect it might be. I want to spend some time now on the sisters themselves, on Delphine and Cassandra Calloway, because for all that this story circles around them, we have said remarkably little about who they actually were day to day, in the long stretches between the men who came and were kept. And the truth is that the most unsettling thing about the Calloway sisters, the thing that separates them from any ordinary idea of a murderer, is precisely how ordinary they seem to have been in the intervals, how they gardened and went to church, and traded eggs and preserves at the general store in Cassie Mills, and were, by every surviving account of the people who knew them casually, pleasant, unremarkable, well-mannered women that no one would ever have thought twice about. There are, scattered through the county records and the recollections Miriam Costello gathered, perhaps a dozen first-hand impressions of the Calloway sisters from people who dealt with them in ordinary ways and never suspected a thing. A storekeeper's daughter remembered Miss Cassandra as the kindest customer we had, always asked after my mother's rheumatism, always remembered which of us children had been sick, and asked was we better. A circuit preacher who took supper with them once, and lived to describe it, recalled Miss Delphine as a woman of considerable learning for that country, who could quote Scripture better than I could, and who spoke of the mercy of God with what seemed to me a real and settled conviction. A neighbor woman traded quilt patterns with Cassandra for 11 years, and described her, without irony, as the best friend I had in that lonesome part of the county, and I'll not hear a word against her, whatever the stories say. This is the part that people find hardest to sit with, and I think it is worth sitting with, because it is true, and because the untruth is more comfortable. We want our monsters to be monstrous all the way through, to give themselves away, to have something in the eyes or the voice or the manner that a careful person could catch. The Calloway sisters did not. They gave nothing away. They kept 44 men, at minimum, over 17 documented years, and in between they were, as far as anyone could tell, good neighbors and devout churchgoers and pleasant company, and I do not think this was a performance they put on and took off. I think, and Orpha Tarr thought, that it was simply and horribly both at once that Delphine Calloway could genuinely ask after your mother's rheumatism and genuinely mean it, and could also, that same night, sit in her parlor and listen with genuine satisfaction to the counting coming up from beneath the second barn, and see no contradiction whatsoever between the two, because for her there was none. Orpha Tarr said something about this once that I have never forgotten. Miriam had pressed her, on one of their later visits, to explain how the sisters could have been the way the neighbors remembered them and the way the ledger proved them to be, both at the same time, and Orpha had been quiet a long while before she answered. "You're thinking about it wrong," Orpha finally said. "You're thinking they were pretending to be kind to hide that they were wicked. But I don't believe they thought of it as wickedness at all. I think, to them, it was more like farming. A farmer can love his land and tend it careful, and be kind to his neighbors, and go to church of a Sunday and mean every word, and still, come slaughter time, do what has to be done to the hogs he's raised, and not lose 1 minute of sleep over it, because the hogs were never people to him. They were stock. I think that's what those men were, to Delphine and Cassandra. Not victims, stock, something the land needed fed, and something they had learned to provide. The way you learn to provide anything your land needs to keep producing. And the terrible part, the part I can't ever get past, is that I don't think they hated those men even a little. I think, in their way, they were almost fond of them, the way a good farmer is fond of good stock. Grandpa said Delphine used to speak of the kept men, sometimes late, when she'd forgotten he was in the room, used to speak of them by name, fondly, the way you'd speak of old friends. "Poor Mr. Boland," she'd say. "Poor Mr. Mercer." They did miss their people so. And Grandpa said it was the fondness that frightened him worse than anything, worse than if she'd been cruel, because cruelty he could have understood. There is one more detail about the sisters that I want to give you, and it is perhaps the strangest of all, because it complicates even the picture of them as farmers of grief, and because no one has ever been able to explain it. In the last years before Delphine's death in 1911, according to fragments Elias Tarr passed down to Orpha, the sisters began to seem afraid, not of discovery. They were never, in all their years, seriously troubled by the law, and seemed to know they would not be. They began to seem afraid of the hollow itself. Elias described Delphine, in her final years, taking the same precautions that visitors were warned to take, declining, on certain evenings, to go near the second barn, keeping to daylight, and, most tellingly, counting. Elias saw Delphine Calloway, the woman who had fed that ground for 30 years, standing at her own parlor window on more than one late evening, lips moving, counting something under her breath, staring out toward the second barn with an expression he could only describe as the look of a person who has kept a large and dangerous animal for a very long time and fed it well and been its master all that while, and who has begun, only lately, to wonder whether the animal has come to think of the arrangement differently than she does. Orphatar believed, and this is speculation, she was always careful to say, the speculation of a woman who spent a lifetime thinking about it, that the sisters had, near the end, come to understand that the thing in that hollow no longer needed them, that they had spent 30 years teaching it, feeding it, refining its terrible skill, and that somewhere in those 30 years it had learned everything they had to teach, and had begun to be able to do the work itself, to draw and to wear and to keep, without any help from the two women who had once been its keepers, and that Delphine Calloway, at the end of her life, standing at her window counting under her breath, had realized that she was no longer the farmer at all, that she had become, without noticing the moment it happened, simply another person living on thin ground, with a lost sister she would one day grieve, and a voice that would one day learn to call her name. Delphine died in 1911. Cassandra sold the land in 1912 and vanished from every record in the country, and I have wondered, ever since I first pieced this together, whether Cassandra Calloway ran not to escape the law, which never pursued her, but to escape the hollow to get herself, and her own eventual grief for the sister she had just lost, as far from that thin ground as she possibly could, before the thing they had spent their lives feeding could learn the sound of Delphine's voice and call it out to Cassandra some night across the dark, and finish the long arithmetic of that place by keeping, at the very last, one of the two women who had kept it. We will never know. Cassandra Calloway walked out of the historical record in 1912 and never walked back into it, but I find I cannot quite believe she got away clean. I do not think anyone gets away clean from ground like that. I think, wherever Cassandra Calloway went, and whatever name she took, there came a night, eventually, when she heard her sister's voice calling her from somewhere it had no business calling from. And I think what she did in that moment, whether she answered, or whether she counted, whether she had learned her own rules well enough to save herself, or whether the teacher, at the last, was undone by the very lesson she had spent a lifetime teaching, is the one part of this story that not even the ledger, not even the letters, not even Orphatar in 70 years of watching was ever able to find out. Let me take you somewhere I have not yet taken you. Inside the second barn, not through the eyes of a victim. No man who entered it ever came back to describe the inside, but through the one partial, fragmentary, second-hand account that exists, which comes to us, improbably, through a boy. His name was Tobias Renner, and in the summer of 1899, 3 years after Everett Coldwell vanished, Tobias was 11 years old, the son of a family that had taken over as caretakers of the property during the brief period after the sisters' departure, when it was held by the Springfield Timber Company and largely unoccupied. The timber company, not knowing or not caring about the property's history, had hired the Renners simply to keep the buildings from falling down and to watch against trespassers, and the Renner family lived, for a little under 2 years, in the main Calloway house, the only family, as far as any record shows, ever to actually live on that ground after the sisters left it. They did not live there long, and they left in a hurry, and Tobias Renner, decades later, an old man of 76, being interviewed by Wendell Cross in 1964, gave the only first-hand description we have of the inside of that barn, from an afternoon when he was 11 years old, and did the one thing every child in every story like this one is warned never to do. He went where he was told not to go. My daddy told us to stay out of the low barn. Tobias told Cross. Told us the first day, told us like he meant it, the way a man tells you a thing he's afraid of without wanting to let on he's afraid. Stay out of the low barn. And I did, for the better part of a year. Because I was a good boy mostly, and because there was something about that barn that made a body want to stay out of it without needing to be told twice. But I was 11, and it was a long, slow summer, and one afternoon my curiosity got the better of my good sense, the way it does with boys. And I went in, and I have spent 65 years wishing I hadn't, and I am going to tell you what I saw, Mr. Cross, because I am an old man now, and you're the first person who ever came asking who I thought might actually believe me. What Tobias Renner described has never been corroborated, and never could be, and I give it to you for exactly what it is. The 65-year-old memory of a frightened 11-year-old boy, unreliable in all the ways such memories are unreliable, and yet consistent in its details, with everything else we know about that place, in ways an 11-year-old boy in 1899 could not possibly have invented. He said the inside of the barn was bigger than the outside. He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has long since stopped hoping anyone will make sense of. I know how it sounds, he said. I knew how it sounded when I was 11, standing in it. The barn was maybe 60 feet on the outside. My daddy had paced it. Inside, it went back further than that. A good deal further. I could not see the back wall of it, Mr. Cross, from the door, and there was no lamp lit, and the light that came in the door behind me did not reach the back of it, and I stood there in the doorway with the afternoon sun on my back, and looked into a barn that went back into a dark that the sun could not touch, and I knew, the way you know things when you're a child, before you've learned to talk yourself out of knowing them, that the dark in that barn was not the ordinary dark of a windowless building. It was the dark of a place that was somewhere else. He said there were stalls, not horse stalls or, he corrected himself, stalls that had perhaps once been horse stalls but were not being used for horses, ran down both sides of the barn as far into the dark as he could see. And he said that in the stalls, in the near ones, the ones the door light reached, there were shapes. I want to be careful how I say this, Tobias told Cross, because it is the part I am least sure of and the part that has frightened me longest. There were men in the stalls, or things in the shape of men, standing, not tied, not pinned, just standing, each one in its own stall, facing the front of it toward the center aisle, the way a horse stands in its stall, facing out. Still. So still, I thought at first, they were scarecrows, or coats hung on posts. And I stood there, and I looked at the nearest one, and I could see it was a man. A grown man in ordinary clothes, standing perfectly still in a stall in a dark barn in the middle of a summer afternoon, and I could not see his face, because his head was down, chin to his chest, the way a man stands when he's asleep on his feet or waiting for something with terrible patience. And while I stood there, Mr. Cross, and this is the thing I have never told a living soul in 65 years, while I stood there, the nearest one lifted its head. Tobias Renner said he did not stay to see the face. He said the small animal part of him that had kept him out of that barn for a year seized control of his legs at last, and he ran out of the barn and across the yard and into the house, and did not stop until he was under his own bed, where his mother found him an hour later, unable to speak, and where he stayed, more or less, until his father moved the family off that property for good less than 2 weeks afterward, a departure Tobias always believed was connected to his own experience, though his father never once discussed it, and though Tobias never worked up the courage to tell his father what he had seen. I heard it, though, Tobias said at the end of his account. As I ran, I have to tell you that part too, or it's not the whole truth. As I ran out of that barn, the one that lifted its head, it spoke. Just once. It said a name. Not my name, Mr. Cross. A woman's name. It said, Eleanor, in a voice full of more longing than I have heard in any voice before or since. Eleanor, like it was asking, like it had been standing in that stall in the dark for years, waiting for someone named Eleanor to come, and it thought, for a moment, when the door opened and the light came in and a small shape stood in it, that maybe, finally, she had. And I have thought about that name every day of my life. Mr. Cross, because I did not know, when I was 11, that it meant anything. It was only when I was a grown man and heard the old stories properly that I learned there had been a cattleman kept at that place years before my family ever came, and that the cattleman had lost a wife, and that the wife's name had been Eleanor. Cornelius Boland's wife was named Eleanor. Boland vanished in 1888. Tobias Renner, who was not born until 1888, and who had no possible way of knowing the name of a dead cattle buyer's dead wife, heard that name spoken from a stall in the dark of the second barn in the summer of 1899, and carried it, uncomprehending, for 65 years. Until an afternoon in 1964, when a folklorist finally told him what it meant, and an old man wept, Cross recorded, for a long time, and would not be comforted, and said only, over and over, that he wished he had gone to him, that he wished he had been braver, that a grown man kept in the dark all those years might have wanted nothing in this world so much as for one living person to walk down that aisle and say, "No, I'm not Eleanor, but I've come to take you out of here all the same." Tobias Renner never went back. No one did. The Renner family left in 1899, and the timber company logged its third of the property, and then abruptly stopped and sold at a loss in 1918. And I have wondered, reading Tobias's account, whether some timber crew, cutting closer and closer to that low gray barn, ever had cause to look inside it, and what they saw if they did, and whether that is the real reason a timber company walked away from a fortune in standing hardwood and never explained itself to anyone. Miriam never followed that particular thread any further in writing. It is, by her own account, the one place in her decade of research where she deliberately chose not to keep pulling. I want to give you one more thread before the end, the oldest one, the one that reaches back before Delphine Calloway ever set foot in Stone County, because I promised you loose threads honestly told, and this is the oldest and loosest of them all, and I think it is the one that will stay with you longest after the rest has faded. I mentioned the Reverend Josiah Pemberton, the circuit-riding preacher, who noted, in 1879, two strange sisters lodging at the old Purnell tenant house and asking, oddly, after families who had recently lost a son or husband. I told you Pemberton died suddenly of a seizure of the heart, only months before Delphine Calloway's cash land purchase, and that no evidence connects his death to the sisters beyond timing. That is all true, but there is more in Pemberton's diary than that single entry, and Miriam Costello, who read the whole of it in the 1950s, found something in its earlier pages that she could never quite fit into the rest of the story, and that I have never been able to fit either, and that I give to you now precisely because it does not resolve. Pemberton had ridden that circuit for 19 years before he ever laid eyes on the Calloway sisters, and in those 19 years his diary records scattered, occasional, never dwelt upon, because Pemberton was a practical man of God and not given to superstition, a recurring local unease about that same patch of ground, going back long before anyone named Calloway lived on it. He records in 1864, burying a man named Coultus, whose family said he had gone wrong in the head after a night lost in the Purnell bottoms, and who had spent his last years, they said, counting compulsively, unable to stop, terrified of losing count. He records, in 1871, a widow who refused to let her sons hunt the thin ground past the old stone wall, a wall that, you will note, was already old in 1871, a full decade before Delphine Calloway supposedly bought the land and, by the county's assumption, built it. He records, in 1876, an old Osage man, one of the few who still passed through that country, telling him through an interpreter that his people had a name for that hollow that the interpreter would not translate, and would only say meant, roughly, the place that keeps, and that his people had not camped there, nor hunted there, nor spoken of there, for longer than any of them could say, going back to the grandfathers of their grandfathers. The place that keeps. Before Delphine Calloway, before the Fieldstone Wall was built, or rebuilt, or built again over something older, before the county, before the Purnells, before any name in any ledger, a hollow that a people who lived on that land for generations before any European ever saw it, already knew to leave alone, already had a name for, already understood to be a place that keeps. Miriam Costello wrote, beside this discovery, the only place in all her careful papers where she allowed herself something like awe rather than dread, I came into this believing I was studying a crime committed by two women across 17 years. I have come to understand that I was studying a single moment in the life of something so much older than the Calloway sisters that they are barely a footnote to it, that Delphine and Cassandra did not create that hollow, or curse it, or even, really, own it, whatever the deed says. They were two people who found a thin place in the world that had been keeping men since before there were deeds, or counties, or ledgers to write their names in, and who learned, for a few decades, to serve it, the way tenants serve a landlord, far older and far more patient than themselves. And when they were done, or when it was done with them, they left or were taken, and the hollow simply went on, as it had gone on before them, as it goes on now, keeping and keeping and keeping, and the only thing that has ever changed about it, in all the centuries of it, is the names of the people, foolish or grieving, or unlucky enough to walk onto its ground, and the names of the few who understood enough to keep others away. That is the oldest thread, and I will not pretend to tie it off, because it does not tie off. The Osage word was never recorded. The interpreter would not say it, and Pemberton did not press. And the old man moved on, and whatever knowledge his people carried about that ground, carried for longer than the county has existed, went where such knowledge goes when the last people who hold it stop being asked. All that survives is a single line in a dead preacher's diary, the place that keeps, and the plain, unbearable fact that the men in that barn, the 44 we can name, and the far greater number we cannot, were not the first, and are not the last, and were never really the Calloway sisters' victims at all. They belonged to the hollow. They always did. The sisters were only the ones who for a while kept the fence mended, and made sure nothing wandered out that ought not to, and thanked an old hired man kindly for 30 years of counting, and stood at a window in the failing light, and understood, too late, that they had never been the keepers of that place. They had only ever been its most useful tenants. And tenants, in the end, are kept too. I mentioned Delphine Calloway's private ledger earlier, the one word, kept, written 44 times across 17 years in a woman's careful, unhurried hand. I want to give you 4 of those 44 names now, briefly, not because their individual stories add anything new to the pattern you've already heard tonight, but because I think a number like 44 stops meaning anything, after a while, if it stays only a number, and I think these men deserve, at minimum, to be more than a tally mark in a dead woman's book. The first entry in the ledger, dated the 4th of June, 1882, reads simply, J. Holcomb, itinerant tinker, age apt, 40, widower by his own account, 3 years. Kept. Nothing else about Holcomb survives anywhere in the county record. He is, as far as any document Miriam Costello ever found can show, the very first name on a list that would eventually run to 44, and he exists today only as 4 words in a murderer's private accounting. The 9th entry, dated the spring of 1886, reads, T. Van, drover, age apty 27, lost a sister to the fever 2 winters past, spoke of her often, kept. Miriam found a separate record, entirely independent of the ledger, confirming that a cattle drover named Thomas Van had indeed passed through Stone County that same spring, driving a herd north to the railhead, and had never arrived at his destination, prompting a brief inquiry from his employer that went nowhere and was eventually dropped. The 22nd entry, dated 1889, reads, "Elder from the Baptist Church at Day, Missouri, name withheld by request, come asking after his own missing deacon. Kept. I want you to sit with that one in particular." This was not a stranger passing through. This was a local minister from a real, still-standing congregation who came to that hollow specifically because a member of his own church had vanished there before him, and who was, himself, according to Delphine's own hand, simply absorbed into the same pattern he had come to investigate. His own church's surviving membership rolls show a gap that same year, one name quietly removed with no death or transfer recorded, and no successor ever installed to the position of deacon he had held. And the 38th entry, dated 1894, 2 years before Everett Coldwell. And this is the one detail from the ledger that Miriam Costello, by her niece's account, found hardest to write about in her own notes, reads, "Young surveyor's assistant, name Mercer, come alone, spoke often at supper of his late mother and the particular sound of her calling voice. Kept." Silas Mercer's own journal, the one you heard from directly earlier tonight, ends mid-word on the 10th of November, 1892. Delphine Calloway's ledger entry for him is dated 1894. There is a 2-year gap between those two dates that no surviving document has ever explained, and Miriam Costello, in the one place in all her papers where she allowed herself something close to open speculation, wrote only this: "I do not know what those 2 years held for Silas Mercer between the night his journal stops and the night Delphine finally wrote 'kept' beside his name, and I have come, reluctantly, to believe that I am glad I do not know, and that the not knowing is very likely a mercy I have done nothing whatsoever to earn. I want to come back, one more time, to the rules, to the 3 warnings that get passed down, in one form or another, through every generation of this story, from Otis Beckwith to Elias Tarr to Orpha Tarr to a librarian in Kissy Mills handing a folder across a desk in 2011. Because I have come to believe, studying this case for as long as I have, that the rules themselves are the most important thing in it, more important than the ledger or the barn or the sisters, and that understanding why they work and why they sometimes fail is the closest anyone has ever come to understanding the hollow itself. Start with the first rule. Do your work in daylight, and be off the ground before the light goes strange on the western ridge. Every account agrees on this, and every account agrees that the hollow's power was weakest by day and strongest in the failing light of dusk and the deep dark after. But I want to point out something that took me a long time to notice, which is that this rule is not really about light at all. It is about time. It is about limiting how long you are on that ground, and in particular about not being on it during the hours when a person's mind naturally loosens, when the guard we all keep up during the busy daylight comes down, when a grieving person is most likely to let a lost name rise up in their thoughts unbidden. The hollow did not need darkness. It needed a mind with its defenses lowered, and dusk was simply when minds lower their defenses. Miriam Costello was undone at dusk. R.T. The hunter was nearly undone at dusk. Silas Mercer heard his mother, always, in the hours near sleep. The rule about daylight is really a rule about never being on that ground at the hour when you are most yourself and least guarded and most likely to grieve out loud without meaning to. The second rule: decline what is offered, however politely it is pressed. Take no supper, no bed, no water from the well. This one is the most concrete and the most consistently ignored because it runs directly against everything decent people are raised to do. To decline a kind offer, pressed warmly 4 or 5 times, requires a rudeness that most people simply cannot sustain, and the sisters knew this and used it. But I have come to think this rule, too, is about something deeper than food and drink. To accept the sisters' hospitality was to enter into a relationship of obligation with them. To become, however briefly, a guest, and a guest owes his host something, owes at minimum the vulnerability of sleeping under the host's roof, of lowering his guard within the host's walls. Everett Coldwell survived 3 nights camped by the creek, declining every offer, and it was only the night he accepted supper and a bed that the hollow took him. The rule about declining is really a rule about never letting that ground establish a claim on you, never crossing the threshold from stranger passing through to guest who has accepted what was offered and now, in some old and binding way, belongs. And the third rule, the one that Elias Tarr near the end trusted more than the others, the one that saved Garland Coldwell and Miriam Costello and R.T. The hunter, the one Silas Mercer begged his sister to remember in a letter she never received. Count something that is entirely your own. This is the rule I find most beautiful and most strange. And I want to try to say clearly why I think it works, because I think it tells us something true, not just about the hollow, but about grief itself. The hollow fed on grief. Specifically, it fed on the shape of a lost voice, learned from a grieving person who spoke that lost one's name and memory out loud on thin ground. Grief was its food, and its language, and its lure. And grief, whatever else it is a kind of reaching backward toward someone who is gone, an ache that pulls the mind out of the present and toward an absence. That reaching was the exact thing the hollow could catch hold of. A mind reaching backward in grief was a mind with a handle on it, a mind that could be gripped and turned and led toward the barn. But counting is the opposite of reaching. Counting is the mind holding itself in the present, occupied with something that has no emotional handle at all, something that reaches toward no one and aches for nothing, pure forward-moving arithmetic that gives the hollow nothing to catch hold of. A number that is yours alone, your own footsteps, your own heartbeats, your rifle's serial number, the ticking of your dead mother's watch, is a thing that cannot be grieved and cannot be shared and cannot be worn by thin ground the way a voice can be worn, because it is not made of longing. It is made of the plain refusal to long for anything at all, for just as long as the counting lasts. And the hollow, which had learned over a century and more to wear any voice and any face and any beloved name, never once learned to wear a number, because a number is the one human thing that grief cannot touch. And grief was the only door that ground ever knew how to open. That is why the rule works. And that, too, is why it is so terribly hard to follow, and why it sometimes fails. Because to count, in the moment the voice of someone you have lost and loved and missed for years is calling your name out of the dark, to choose arithmetic over your own mother's voice, to hold a meaningless number in your mind, instead of turning toward the sound you would give anything to hear again, is to refuse your own grief at the exact moment it is offered. Everything it has ever wanted. It is the hardest thing in the world. Miriam Costello, a trained and forewarned woman, took 3 or 4 steps toward the fence before her watch saved her. Silas Mercer, begging his sister to count, could not do it himself. The rule is simple to state and nearly impossible to keep. And the reason it is nearly impossible to keep is the same reason it works. Because grief wants, more than anything, to be answered, and the whole discipline of survival in that hollow comes down to the terrible refusal to answer it. I told you Orpha Tarr died in 1976 at the age of 94, and I want to spend a little time on how she spent those final years, because I think the shape of her ending tells you something about the peculiar, difficult kind of duty she had inherited from her grandfather, a duty she never asked for and never fully managed to set down, even at the very end of a very long life. Orpha never married. This was, by every account of people who knew her, not for lack of opportunity. She was, by several surviving photographs, a striking woman in her youth, quick-witted and well-liked around Cassie Mills, but because, as she told Miriam Costello once, in a rare unguarded moment near the end of one of their long afternoon conversations, a woman who spent her whole life keeping half an ear turned toward that hollow doesn't have much left over to give a husband, and it wouldn't be fair to ask a man to live with a wife who's always listening for something he can't hear and wouldn't want to. She lived her entire life within 4 miles of the hollow's edge, in the same modest farmhouse her grandfather Elias had retired to in 1906, and she made it, without ever formally announcing the fact to anyone, her business to know every new owner of the Calloway parcel as it changed hands over the decades, to be the one who quietly, in a friendly, neighborly way that never once raised suspicion, made sure each new family understood gently that the old fenced-off section wasn't worth the bother of clearing, that the ground back there had never grown anything decent even before her own grandfather's time, that it was simpler, really, just simpler all around, to leave it be. She kept, in her final decade, a small notebook of her own, not as detailed as Miriam's research, not as haunted as Silas Mercer's journal, but a plain, practical record of names. Every researcher, journalist, curious relative of a missing man, or simple passerby, whoever came asking about that hollow in her lifetime, and what she told each of them, and how much, in her own careful judgment, each of them could be trusted to carry that knowledge responsibly rather than go looking for trouble themselves. Miriam Castello's name appears in that notebook, dated to their first meeting in 1953, with a small notation beside it that Miriam only saw after Orpha's death, when the notebook passed, along with a handful of other effects, into Miriam's own keeping. M.C. Sharp, careful, grieves quietly, doesn't know it yet herself. Watch this one close, she'll want to test the fence line eventually. They always do, the sharp ones. Hope I'm still here to catch her if she does. Orpha very nearly was not still there to catch her. Miriam's near disaster came in 1955, when Orpha was 73 years old, and by Miriam's own account, arriving at Orpha's door that midnight, shaken and torn-sleeved, she found the old woman already awake, already dressed, already standing at her own front window looking out toward the dark shape of the ridge, as though she had known, somehow, before any car ever pulled into her drive, that this particular night was the night it would finally happen. "I've had that feeling before," Orpha told her, once Miriam had calmed enough to speak. "Not often, but I've had it, a kind of pull in my own chest, toward that hollow, on nights when somebody's out there testing its edges. I don't rightly know how to explain it any better than that, except to say that watching that ground for 60 years does something to a person, whether they asked for it to or not, and I expect it'll keep doing it to me till the day I die." It very nearly did precisely that. Orpha Tarr's own final years were marked, according to the handful of people who visited her regularly toward the end, a niece from Cassville, a young folklore graduate student named Wendell Cross, who had begun corresponding with her in 1972, and would go on, decades later, to publish the only academic paper ever written on the case, under deliberately vague pseudonyms for every location and family name involved by a slow, quiet unease that none of them could fully account for at the time, and that only made sense, in retrospect, after her death. She began in 1974, keeping her curtains drawn on the side of the house facing the ridge, day and night, a habit her niece found odd but attributed, not unreasonably, to simple old-age eccentricity. She stopped that same year, making her once regular drives past the Kissy Mills turnoff to check on whichever family currently held the Calloway parcel, delegating that quiet neighborly watchfulness, for the first time in nearly 7 decades of her family's unbroken vigilance, to young Wendell Cross instead, whom she had, by that point, come to trust with more of the accumulated knowledge than she had ever shared with anyone outside her own family. And in the spring of 1976, some months before her death, she told her niece, in what the niece only later understood as a kind of quiet handing off, that she had begun, some nights, to hear faintly, from a house 4 miles distant, on nights when the wind sat right something very like counting, a low voice, keeping a number, going on and on into the small hours, and that she had come to believe, though she never explained fully why, even to her own family, that it was not a threat calling to her the way It had called to Everett Coldwell or Silas Mercer, or nearly claimed Miriam Costello. She believed, she told her niece, that it was something closer to a resonance, an old woman, having spent an entire lifetime standing guard at the edge of thin ground, finally beginning, in her own final months, to hear that ground's own low, counting the way a person who has lived beside a river for 80 years finally starts to hear, even in a perfectly still and silent room, the river's sound going on somewhere just beneath their own thoughts, whether the river is actually audible or not. Orpha Tarr died in her sleep in that same farmhouse on the 9th of March, 1976. Her niece found her the next morning, in bed, hands folded, an expression her niece described gently as more peaceful than I ever once saw her manage while she was living, and on the nightstand beside her, a single sheet of paper in her own careful hand that read only, "I counted as long as I was able. Wendell has the rest of it now. Be gentle with him." It is a heavier thing to carry than anybody who hasn't carried it can rightly understand, and I am sorry, truly sorry, that there was never anyone else willing to help me carry it these 60 years. Wendell Cross carried it, by all accounts, for another 41 years, until his own death in 2017, at which point, and this is the detail that brings us, finally, back into the present, the small circle of researchers who have quietly maintained an awareness of that hollow's history. One generation passing careful, incomplete knowledge to the next, much as Elias Tarr once passed it to Orpha, currently numbers, as far as anyone I've spoken with can determine, exactly 3 living people. None of them, for reasons I think you now understand quite well, are willing to have their names spoken aloud on a recording like this one. Miriam Costello lived a long life after that October evening in 1955. She taught school in Stone County for another 22 years, retired in 1977, the year after Orpha Tarr's death, and moved to a small house in Springfield to be nearer her surviving niece, where she lived quietly, by every account, well-liked and well-regarded, until her own death in the winter of 1994 at the age of 73. But those who knew her in that later chapter of her life, her niece, a former student who became a close friend, 2 other local historians who corresponded with her over the years about county records entirely unrelated to Calloway Hollow, all noted, independently, over decades, a handful of small, consistent habits that never left her. Habits nobody around her fully understood the origin of, because Miriam, true to the promise she made Orpha Tarr the night of that near disaster, never spoke of the hollow to anyone outside the small circle of researchers who eventually earned her trust enough to hear the full account. She counted things. Her niece remembered this clearly, and remembered it, in later years, as simply Aunt Miriam's way. She counted her own footsteps climbing any staircase, silently, lips moving just slightly, every single time, without fail, for the rest of her life. She counted stitches when she sewed, a habit she picked up late, in her 40s, that her niece found charming and old-fashioned and never once connected, because she had no reason to a dead woman named Josephine Coldwell, whom Miriam had read about in an archive, but never met. A woman who 40 years and 2 states away from anything Miriam ever wrote down, had had exactly the same habit for exactly the same unspoken reason. A thing done in silence doesn't feel finished. She wore a wristwatch every single day of her life after that October night, and replaced it when the mechanism finally wore out in the 1970s, not with a modern quartz model that would have kept better time, but with another wind-up mechanical watch specifically, because she told her niece once, the only time she ever came close to explaining the habit, and even then, only in the vaguest possible terms, I like to be able to feel it ticking against my own pulse. Some habits a person picks up young stay with them their whole life, whether or not the reason for them ever quite makes sense to anyone else, and she never, not once, in the remaining 39 years of her life, drove or walked past the turnoff for the old Cassie Mills Road without, according to her niece, who rode with her on that stretch of highway, perhaps a dozen times over the decades on trips to visit family further south, going quiet for exactly as long as the Calloway Hollow turnoff remained visible in the car's mirror, her lips moving faintly, counting something only she could hear, until the turnoff had fallen well behind them and the ordinary conversation of the drive could safely resume. There was one final night, late in her life, that her niece only learned about after Miriam's death, from a letter found among her effects, addressed to no one in particular, dated the 11th of October, 1991, 36 years to the day after her walk along that fence line, as a young woman, and clearly intended, by its tone, as a kind of private record Miriam meant to leave behind for whoever eventually sorted through her papers, rather than a letter meant to be sent. In it, Miriam wrote that she had, that evening, at the age of 70, driven out past Kissy Mills alone, on an impulse she could not fully explain even to herself, and parked on the county road near the old turnoff, and sat in her car in the gathering dark, for what she judged to be close to an hour, engine off, simply looking down the old road toward where the fence line would be, though she could not see it from that distance in the failing light. She wrote that she had not gotten out of the car. She wrote that she had at one point rolled down her window slightly, and that she believed, though she was honest, even at 70, even alone, even writing only for herself, about how uncertain a 70-year-old woman's ears can be on a quiet October evening 36 years after a fright that shaped the whole rest of her life, that she had heard faint and far off. Carried on whatever wind moves through a hollow like that at dusk, a voice calling a name. Not her own name, this time, a different one. She did not recognize it, and she was careful to write that she could not be certain, even then, whether she had truly heard anything at all, or whether 36 years of memory and habit had simply taught her ear to hear that hollow's voice in any ordinary evening wind. She wrote that she rolled the window back up, started the engine, and drove home, counting the mile markers out loud the entire way. The way she always had, the way she supposed she always would, for however many years she had left. She died 3 years later, in her sleep, at home, in Springfield, and her niece, going through her effects afterward, found tucked into the back of a desk drawer, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief that had belonged to Orpha Tarr, gifted to Miriam sometime in the 1960s, and kept, apparently, for the rest of her life, a single sheet of paper in Miriam's own careful hand, undated, listing 44 names. Beside each name, a small check mark, and beneath the last name, in the same careful hand, one final line, unexplained, that her niece has never fully understood and has, by her own account, chosen not to try too hard to understand, because some things, she has said, a person is better off simply letting rest. The line read, "There were more than 44. I only ever managed to give 44 of them their names back. I hope, wherever the rest of them are, that someone eventually does the same for them. I have given you a great deal of history now, a great many names and dates, and disappearances, stretching across more than a century, and I want to stop, before we come to the end, and ask you to sit with the sheer weight of the arithmetic, because I think the arithmetic is the thing that finally makes this real in a way no single story can. 44 documented names in Delphine Calloway's ledger across 17 years, from 1881 to 1898. That is, one man kept, on average, every 4.5 months for 17 years on a single farm in the Missouri Ozarks, without one arrest, without one conviction, without one serious investigation that ever came to anything. Sit with how that was possible. Sit with what it says about the men who vanished, that they were, almost to a man, exactly the kind of men the world does not look very hard for. Drummers and drifters and itinerant tradesmen, widowers and grieving sons traveling alone, men whose families were far away and whose absence took months to be noticed and years to be acted on, men whose disappearance the county could file under misadventure on the road and forget. The Hollow did not just feed on grief. It fed, specifically, on the grief of the unwatched, on lonely men whom no one would miss quickly enough to matter. And this was not an accident. Delphine Calloway's ledger notes. Again and again, the isolation of the men she kept. Widower, no family spoken of. Traveling alone. Sister back east, not close. She was not just noting who grieved. She was noting who could be taken without consequence, and the overlap between the two, the grieving and the unwatched, is the whole dark engine of this story. And then remember that 44 is only the number that could be proven. Remember the cedar circle, the ring of weathered posts Garland Coldwell glimpsed in 1910, carved with marks in no known alphabet, tallied in rows that ran, by his hurried and frightened count, to considerably more than 44. Remember that Delphine Calloway bought that hollow in 1881, already thin, already hungry, already by Orphatar's belief, worked by others before her under other names, going back further than any record reaches. If the ledger counts 17 years and 44 men, and the cedar posts count something older and larger, then the true number, the number no one will ever assemble, is not 44. 44 is just the portion of it that happened to fall within the years one particular woman kept one particular book. 44 is the number that had a ledger to be written in. The rest had only the ground, and the ground keeps no names. The rest of it the men taken before 1881, before the Calloways, before any ledger, back into however long that ground has been thin, the rest of it is uncounted and will stay uncounted. And that, I think, is the real horror at the bottom of this whole story. Not the 44 we can name. The unknown multitude we cannot, standing in stalls in a dark that the sun cannot reach, each one waiting for an Eleanor or a Mama or a Josephine who is never going to come. Miriam Costello spent the better part of a decade recovering 44 names, and she wrote, near the end of her life, that she considered it the most important work she ever did, and also the most futile, and that both of those things were true at once, and did not cancel each other out. I gave 44 men their names back, she wrote. I took them out of the ledger, where they were only tally marks, and I put them back into the record as men, with families and griefs and histories, men who had once been 9 years old and missed their mothers, men who had lost wives and could not stop reaching backward toward them, men whose only crime was to grieve out loud on the wrong patch of ground. It matters that they have their names back. I have to believe it matters, or I cannot account for how I spent my life. But I know, too, that giving a dead man his name back does not bring him home, and does not answer the question of where home even is for a man kept in that hollow, and does not do one single thing to close the thin place in the ground, or empty the stalls in that barn, or bring peace to whatever is still standing in the dark down there, counting. All I did was write down 44 names. It is the most I could do. It was not remotely enough. It never could have been. And I have made my peace, as much as a person can, with having done the most I could do while knowing it was not enough, because I have come to believe that this is simply what it is to be a decent person standing at the edge of something too large to fix. You do the small true thing that is in your power, and you do not pretend it is larger than it is, and you do not stop doing it just because it is small. Before I bring us to the close, I want to give you one last account, the most recent first-hand experience anyone has connected to that hollow, and the only one that comes from a person still young enough that you might someday cross paths with them, though you would never know it, because they too have asked that their name never be spoken. In the autumn of 2022, a woman I will call only J, a graduate student in American folklore, in her late 20s, working, as it happens, on the very academic lineage that Wendell Cross began, and that his 3 surviving successors have quietly maintained, made the decision that every serious student of this case eventually seems compelled to make, and that every wise person connected to it has spent a century trying to prevent. She decided to go and see the hollow for herself. She did not go carelessly. She had read everything: Everett Coldwell's notebook, Silas Mercer's letters, Pico's testimony, Miriam Costello's papers, Tobias Renner's account of the barn, the whole terrible archive. She knew the rules better than almost anyone alive. She went in daylight, early, with hours of light ahead of her. She declined nothing, because there was nothing to decline. The land is owned now by a shell company with no human face, and there was no one there to offer her supper or a bed or water from a well, and she counted the entire time. She told the one person she later confided in that she counted her own footsteps from the moment she left her car, out loud, steadily, and did not once let the count break, from the county road all the way to within sight of the low gray barn and all the way back again. She was, she believed, as prepared as a human being could be, and she was right to be afraid anyway, because being prepared is not the same as being safe. And the hollow, she learned, had one more variation left in it that a century of accounts had not fully prepared her for. Jay had not lost anyone. This was, she thought, her great protection. She was young. Her parents were living. She had suffered no deep grief for that thin ground to catch hold of, and she had reasoned, as Miriam Costello once reasoned, that a person carrying no great loss carried no great handle. But she had forgotten, or had not fully weighed, the thing Orpha Tarr warned Miriam about all those years ago, that grief is not the only door. That curiosity, held closely enough, turned over obsessively enough, worn into a groove deep enough, can serve nearly as well. And Jay had spent 3 years of her life, by that autumn, thinking about almost nothing but that hollow. She did not hear a lost loved one's voice, because she had no lost loved one for it to become. What she heard, standing within sight of the barn with her own footsteps, counted to 411, was worse, in its way, and stranger, and it is the reason her account is the one I have chosen to end on. She heard counting. Not her own, she was keeping her own count steady. 411, 412. Underneath it, or beneath it, or somehow behind it, she heard another counting, a great many voices counting together, low, out of the ground, out of the barn, out of everywhere and nowhere, counting in a rhythm that was almost but not quite in time with her own. And she understood, standing there, with a horror that she said was unlike anything the theory had prepared her for, exactly what she was hearing. She was hearing them, all of them, the kept, counting, the way Elias Tarr said they counted, the way they had been counting for longer than anyone could reckon, down in the thin ground, never reaching any number, never stopping. And she understood something else, in that moment, that no previous account had ever quite arrived at, because no previous survivor had been protected by counting while the ground itself was counting back. She understood that the counting, the one defense, the one human thing the hollow could not wear, the rule that Elias Tarr trusted above all others, the number that is yours alone and cannot be grieved, was not something the survivors had invented. It was something they had learned from the kept. The kept men, down in the dark, had figured out the one thing that held any part of them intact against that place, the one refusal that grief could not dissolve, and they were doing it, all of them, endlessly, counting to hold on to some last thread of themselves and the rule that Elias Tarr passed to Orpha, that Orpha passed to Miriam, that a librarian passed to a hunter, that saved a graduate student in 2022, was not a defense against the kept at all. It was the kept men's own last discovery, whispered up out of the ground to the living, the only message they were still able to send. Count. Count, and do not stop. It is the only thing down here that works. It is the only part of us that is left. Jay walked out. She kept her count, and she walked out, and she did not go back, and she is, as far as I know, well, and quietly carrying on the lineage of watchers that stretches back through Wendell Cross to Orpha Tarr, to Elias Tarr, and beyond. But she said one thing to the person she confided in that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first heard it, and it is where I have decided to leave the first-hand accounts, because I do not think anything could follow it. She said that as she walked out, counting, the counting from the ground followed her all the way to the gate, All those voices keep on their endless rhythm just underneath her own, and that at the very edge of the property, at the last moment before she crossed the line and the sound fell away behind her. The counting from the ground changed just for an instant. It faltered. All those voices, for one single beat, stopped counting their own endless number, and instead, together, in perfect unison, said a single word to her. The only word that have ever been recorded as saying to a living person who was leaving instead of coming. And the word was not a name, and it was not a plea, and it was not Eleanor or Mama, or any of the lost loves the hollow had used as bait for a century. The word was, remember. And then the counting resumed, and she crossed the line, and the sound fell away, and she stood in the ordinary daylight on the ordinary county road, shaking, with her own count still going on her lips, 491, 492. And she understood that she had been given a job, the same job Miriam Costello understood at the end of her life, the same job every watcher in this whole long line inherited whether they wanted it or not. Not to save the kept, because the kept cannot be saved. Not to close the hollow, because the hollow cannot be closed. Only to remember them, to keep their names out of the ledger and in the record. To make sure that the men in that dark are, at the very least, not forgotten by the living, even if they cannot be freed by them. To count them in the only way the living can count the lost, by name and out loud, and refusing to stop. I want to return, in these last stretches, to the ordinary daylight facts of the place as it exists right now, today, because I think, after all the voices and the barns and the counting in the dark, it is important to remember that this is not a fable set in some vague and distant once upon a time. It is a real parcel of land with a real legal description that you could, in theory, drive to, and that people do drive past, unknowing, every single day. The parcel is still there. 240 acres, more or less, though various sales and boundary adjustments over the decades have shaved and shifted its edges. The main Calloway house burned in 1934, a fire the then owners attributed to a lightning strike, though there was no storm recorded in the county that night, a small discrepancy that Miriam Costello noted and never resolved. The house was never rebuilt. Its foundation is still visible, they say, a rectangle of fieldstone half swallowed by 70 years of brush, though I have never seen it myself, and would not, I confess, go looking for it. The fieldstone wall Everett Coldwell admired, the one that represented 1,100 man-hours of labor for no agricultural purpose, still stands, largely intact, and has been remarked upon by more than one hiker and hunter over the years as unusually well preserved for its age, unusually free of the frost heave and settling that should, by every rule of masonry, have brought a dry stacked wall down generations ago. No one has ever explained why that wall does not fall. It simply does not fall. It has not fallen in 140 years, and I do not think it is going to. And the second barn, the low gray barn that measures smaller inside than out, the barn Everett Coldwell paced and found wrong, the barn Silas Mercer was warned away from, the barn a 19-year-old boy named Tobias Renner walked into on a summer afternoon and never stopped being afraid of, the barn that a wounded deer led a hunter named R.T. to the edge of, in 2011, that barn is still standing, too. It appears, as I told you, on the 2019 aerial survey, filed with the county assessor, a small gray rectangle, roofline sagging well within the fenced-off easement. It has been standing for 140 years, through fire and timber and 7 changes of ownership, through decades in which no one has been permitted to enter it on land that every owner has paid, one way or another, to keep fenced and posted and left alone. Barns fall. Barns fall faster than almost any other built thing, once they are abandoned and unmaintained. A decade of neglect will usually bring a barn down. This one has had a century of neglect and more, and it is still standing, and I do not think that is an accident either, and I do not think it is going to fall, and I do not think anyone who understands what it is would ever be foolish enough to hope that it might, because I do not think any of us wants to know what would come out of it if it did. The people who quietly watch that hollow, the three of them, now, whoever they are, have one shared conviction that they have passed down along with everything else, and it is this: the worst thing that could happen to that hollow is not that it be forgotten. A forgotten hollow is a starved hollow, a hollow with no grieving strangers wandering onto its thin ground, a hollow slowly going quiet as the last people who know to stay away keep others away without ever quite saying why. The worst thing that could happen to that hollow is that it be discovered, that it become known, that it become a destination, that it draw the curious and the grieving and the thrill-seeking the way such places always eventually draw them once the word gets out. Every stranger who walks onto that ground carrying a loss is a meal. Every grieving person who goes looking for a good scare and finds instead their own dead mother's voice calling them toward a barn is a name that might someday be cut into a cedar post in a language no one can read. This is the thing I have wrestled with, honestly, in deciding whether to tell you this story at all, because I am, in the telling of it, doing the one thing the watchers most fear. I am making it known. I am putting the shape of that hollow into your mind. And some of you, I know how these things go. Some of you are already, right now, wondering exactly where in Stone County it is, already half planning to find out. And so, I am going to do the only thing I can do about that, which is to tell you as plainly and as seriously as I have ever told you anything, in the voice not of a storyteller now, but of a person who has spent a long time with this and means every word. Do not go looking for it. I have deliberately left out the precise location. I have changed and obscured certain details. I have done this on purpose, and I will not correct it, and I would ask you not to try to correct it for me in the comments if you happen to know or think you know. Because whatever you have lost, and if you are the kind of person drawn to a story like this one, told the way I have told it, at this hour of the night, then I would wager you have lost someone, and I would wager you carry it more quietly and more constantly than you let anyone see whatever you have lost. That hollow already knows the shape of it. It does not need you to speak the name. It only needs you to be standing on thin ground when the name rises up in you unbidden, the way lost names always do, in the dark, near sleep, when your guard is down, and there is no scare in the world, no story, no thrill, no answer to any question that is worth walking onto that ground to find. The kept did not think it was worth it either. Not one of them. Ask them. They are still down there, all of them, counting, and if you listen closely to the shape of what they are counting, I think you will find it is not really a number at all. I think it is the same word they gave to a frightened graduate student at the edge of the property in 2022, said over and over in the only language they have left to anyone living who might still be able to hear it and heed it. Remember us, but do not join us. Remember us, but for the love of God, and of whoever you have lost, and of whatever count you are keeping to hold yourself together in this life, do not come down here to join us. There is a small thing I have held back for the very end because I wanted you to have everything else first, and because it is the detail that, of all the details in this long account, I think about most often in my own quiet hours. It concerns Everett Coldwell's wife, Josephine, the woman whose death began this whole telling. The seamstress who counted her stitches out loud because a thing done in silence never felt finished to her. You will remember that I told you, at the very start, to hold on to the small human details of Josephine Coldwell, how she counted her stitches aloud, how she hated buttermilk, the childhood burn scar on her left forearm that she was strangely proud of. I told you these things mattered, and I told you they would be harder to shake by the end of the night than anything else, and I want, now, to tell you why. Because when Miriam Costello, decades later, recovered Everett Coldwell's notebook and read that final, unfinished entry, the one about the fifth man in the gray coat, the one that cuts off mid-sentence, she noticed something that the sheriff in 1896 had no way to notice. Because the sheriff had never read Everett's letters, had never learned the small human shape of the wife Everett had lost. Miriam had, and Miriam noticed that in the days before Everett accepted that fatal supper, in the entries where he described the counting he heard across the creek at night, the voice pitched low and even, going 1, 2, 3. Everett never once wrote that he recognized the voice. He heard counting. He did not, in those early entries, hear Josephine. But Josephine counted. Out loud. It was her particular habit, the one Everett loved, the one he wrote down word for word because he liked the way she said it. A thing done in silence doesn't feel finished to me, Ev. I like to hear myself get somewhere. And Miriam Costello understood, reading that notebook 70 years after Everett Coldwell disappeared, that the hollow had not needed to become Josephine's speaking voice to reach Everett Coldwell. It had not needed to call his name in her tones, the way it called Silas Mercer's mother, the way it called Garland's, the way it called a cattleman's dead wife by the sound of her tuneless hum. It had reached Everett through the one sound most particular to the woman he had lost, the sound he would have known anywhere, the sound that meant her more than her name ever could, the low, even, patient sound of a woman counting out loud in the dark, getting somewhere, finishing a thing she could not bear to leave unfinished. That is the detail I cannot shake, and I will leave it with you, because I think it contains the whole terrible heart of this story in a single turn. Everett Coldwell survived 3 nights by counting by holding a number of his own against the dark, and the thing in that hollow reached him, in the end, not by breaking his count, but by counting back, by giving him, out of the dark across the creek, the exact sound of the person he had loved and lost, doing the exact thing she had always done, the counting that had been, to him, the sound of home and safety, and a woman finishing her work by lamplight, while he watched. The one defense he had a voice, counting in the dark, was turned, with a cruelty so precise it can only be called personal, into the one lure he could not refuse. And I think that is why his final entry does not read like a man being deceived. I think, at the end, some part of Everett Coldwell knew. I think that is why he wrote that he needed to know whether the man in the gray coat had his face. I think he had already understood that the counting he was walking toward was not Josephine, could not be Josephine, and I think he walked toward it anyway, the way Silas Mercer answered his mother anyway, the way Amos Hargrove turned his horse around anyway, because there are some sounds that the grieving heart will walk toward, even knowing, even certain, that the thing making them is not, cannot be, the person it has learned to imitate. And the hollow knew that too. The hollow always knew that. It is, in the end, the only thing the hollow ever really knew, that grief will walk toward the shape of what it has lost, into any dark, through any gate, past any number a person tries to hold against it, and that the walking is not weakness, and is not foolishness, and is not a failure of the rules. It is love. It is only ever love, turned into a door, by ground too thin to tell the difference between the two. So, have you ever stood at the edge of a hollow where the birds don't sing, even in the middle of summer, even with the creek running low and sweet just 20 feet away? Have you ever felt a fence line, built too well by hands that had all the time in the world, and known, before anyone told you a single word about it, that you did not want to walk any further along it than you had to? Somewhere out past Kissy Mills, in Stone County, Missouri, there is still a barn that measures smaller inside than out, on land owned by a company with no human face, behind a fence that every owner for 140 years has paid, in one way or another, to keep standing. And somewhere in the ground around it, past 44 names that took a school teacher the better part of a decade to recover, there is a number nobody living has ever finished counting. If you have your own story like this one, a piece of ground back home that never sat right with you, a warning some elder in your own family gave you once and then never spoke of again, I want to hear it. Put it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the best cases I've ever covered started exactly that way, from somebody in the comments who finally decided to say the quiet part out loud. Next time, we're heading into the Missouri boot heel, to a case involving a drowned church and a congregation that the state's own records show kept right on filing membership rolls for 11 years after the flood that supposedly killed every one of them. That one's coming soon, and I don't think you'll want to miss it. And whatever you count tonight, count it out loud and count it slow, and do not stop until the number is whole. I have counted them for you as best I could. Now the counting is yours. Keep it well. Until then, keep your own count, and sleep with the door barred.